This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members, officers and the public to today's meeting of the Transport Committee. Our main item of business today is a discussion on the walkability of London's pavements. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode. And can I ask guests and members to position their microphones so they can be heard clearly? I think you're all fine. Can I start by asking our clerk, Hannah Barlow, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies received from Assembly Member Mwema, for whom Assembly Member Mafous is substituting.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meetings of the committee held on 17th of June and 8th of July 2025 to be signed by me as correct records? Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from its previous meetings and the additional correspondence received and sent? And can I ask the committee to note the actions taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree our letters to TfL and the British Transport Police on the withdrawal of blue light status from emergency response unit vehicles, our letters to TfL and the British Transport Police on fare evasion, our letter to Heathrow Airport on expansion proposals. Thank you. Can I also ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London to our report on car clubs and the response from the Chief Constable of British Transport Police to our letter on the withdrawal of blue light status from emergency response unit vehicles? Thank you. It's been a couple of months since we've met, so that was a lot of business. So we now move on to our main item of business, a discussion on the walkability of London's pavements. Today's discussion will be split into 2 panels, and I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests. So Tom Noble, Senior Urban Designer, Create Streets; Rob Anderson, Research Director, Centre for London; Rob Goodall, Associate Director and Global Active Travel Lead and Decarbonisation Expert at Arup; and Dr. Tom Cohen, Reader in Transport Policy at the University of Westminster. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for giving up your time this morning. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is a general question to all of you, and then we will pass on to the other Assembly members for further questions. So TfL states that walking is the most common way of moving around the city, yet the daily walking trips made by Londoners has not increased since 2019. What do you feel has caused this stagnation in walking trips? Would anyone like to jump in first, or shall I? Thanks, Tom.
I press that button.
Yes,
and it seems to have had
right.
the magic effect. Well, thank you for the question. I fear that I'm going to sound just like an academic in saying that we shouldn't rush to any one interpretation of stagnation. Yes, walking trips do seem to have stalled, but there could be lots of reasons for that, one of which is the walkability of the network, and I suppose that's what we're going to talk about most today. But other things have to be allowed for, such as ongoing changes in the land use planning of London, the nature of the trips that people need to make, the constraints upon those trips, which make walking or wheeling either feasible or not feasible. So I think we would need to do quite a bit of research to be able to answer the question definitively. But yes, I'm more than ready to believe that walkability is one of the explanations.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Rob Anderson?
I'd agree with Rob about some caution around attribution. And in terms of the trends, we have seen broad bounce back citywide from the pandemic. We're more back to sort of 2016, 2017 levels, but we're not seeing that kind of growth towards TfL's target of 80-20, which we would all like to see in terms of improving the experience of the city all round. In terms of attribution, I think there is some interesting data points when you look geographically. So, for example, the West End has pretty much completely recovered and has seen quite strong growth, but we are seeing less growth, less return in places like the city, these commuter destinations, which could suggest this is the kind of longer-term settling in effects of post-pandemic work patterns, so greater hybrid working. But I really agree with Rob that it's important not to jump to attribution.
Thank you. Rob Goodall?
Yes, I'd agree with what everyone else is saying, really, but it's that not jumping to conclusions. I think that more research is needed into it. Land use changes, modal competition. We've obviously seen a boom in micromobility, which has actually seen a lot of that shift away from walkability. So whilst we've seen a huge rise in the use of micromobility in terms of electric cycle hire, in terms of e-scooters, that is tending to attract away from some of that walkability. But as the others on the panel have mentioned, that transition away from different working patterns, how people are travelling into the central areas, and we've all seen, I'm sure you've all seen around the different uses of public transport across the week, and battles that TfL are dealing with that, and that's been really realised in the number of people walking around in those central areas as well. So a lot of the work we do as well is in the built environment, so actually looking at the growth and development of housing and residential across London. Obviously we've seen a stagnation in that as well, so there's lots of underlying trends that have been underpinning why these changes have really been realised. But a lot of the work we also do with the London boroughs as well is around that walkability, to understand actually what's happening on street and that competing use of that street, and the usage of both footways and also highway capacity, and how that's all merging together, and that distinct competition between all these different modes has really underlined that impact. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I probably have nothing to add to those excellent answers, to be honest. I think, yes, the commuting patterns is a big one, and I think, like everyone says, it's very difficult to sort of unpick that from a headline number at the moment. So
Thanks.
further research needed.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much, all. Assemblymember Garrett.
Yeah, so the graph in our briefing shows, it goes all the way back to 2000, and it shows a steady increase. This is daily walking trips, so it's not a modal share, it's the total number of trips people are making. And what that shows is almost 2 decades of unbroken increase from 2000, when our data starts, all the way through to 2018. Then in 2018, TfL launched a walking action plan, at which point it immediately stagnates. So there's obviously a joke in there about government strategies having opposite impact. But it seems to me, although all of the factors you've just described could all play into the mix, there's a small blip in the pandemic, but the plateau continues before and after. It just seems to me the explanation you brought up, Rob Goodall, about micromobility seems like the most likely explanation for that plateau, because that is 2017, 2018, 2019. That's when they were first coming in and subsequently have become quite dominant. And so presumably that is likely to be the main reason why that stalls. And so my question really is, if that's the predominant explanation for that, elbow in the trend from a steady continuous increase to a flat line, that does seem to dominate everything else in terms of the other factors. But is that really necessarily a problem if that's the choice that people are making? We'll come on to street clutter. So other people can be asking shortly about street clutter. I'm just thinking about, as a policy objective, is it a problem if people have stopped walking because they're getting an e-scooter or an e-bike instead? Tom Cohen?
Well, at the University of Westminster, I'm part of the Active Travel Academy, and we would tend to think of all active travel as good travel, as in it all involves a certain amount of physical exercise, and that's beneficial in all sorts of ways, which I don't need to tell you about. So we wouldn't necessarily prefer walking, wheeling to cycling. So there isn't necessarily a problem in that sense. I have a feeling that we will probably talk about certain conflicts that do arise between active modes as being a possible explanation for people feeling less keen to walk and wheel than they perhaps did. But I'm intrigued that you talk about 2018 as being the start point for micromobility, because it feels to me as if the real explosion in e-cycle hire has been over the last 3 or 4 years. So maybe there was something else happening before 2018 which helps to explain, in addition to the growth of e-cycle hire, which I think is a major part of it, as Rob G pointed out.
Well, I think you're right. There were 2 phases, weren't there? There was the early phase of people like OFO who came and went, and then the subsequent phase, mostly during and since the pandemic, when Lime Bike and Human Forest and all the others have been much more predominant. So I think you're right that it's become a much bigger factor. But it's a fact that the flat line started in 2018. And I don't particularly want to pin it on Sadiq Khan's plan to introduce a walking strategy. It seems correlation, not necessarily causation. But it does match the data.
Sure. I suppose I would say that the likes of OMO and OFO were considerably less significant in the metamorphosis of London's transport than the likes of Lime. They came and went. They were a big noise, but they weren't really going to be transformational because they had so many significant shortcomings. And we don't see that with the likes of Lime and Forest. That really does appear to be a fundamental and quite possible lasting change.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Assemblymember McCartney.
Yep. Thank you. I'm just going to ask a very quite general question. That's, are TfL and the Mayor doing enough to remove street clutter from the streets? And are there any examples of good practice that they should be looking to replicating? I don't know who wants to go first. Rob Anderson, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember, for picking this one up because of our report on street clutter a couple of years ago, where we did an audit of 3 kind of major locations in central London, classifying forms of street clutter. identifying that about half of the street clutter items were transient, i.e. there was something you could do about it relatively easily, and others were, sort of defunct items like old phone kiosks and things like that. And one of the recommendations we made out of that was for a GLA area-wide ban on A-boards, and that has not been adopted by the GLA. It has been adopted by the city as of the beginning of this year, with enforcement happening this year. And Waltham Forest are consulting on a similar approach, which is going to be about, I think, is basically about advertising hurdles and sales and letting signs and things like that. So I'd say that recommendation has not been adopted and was one of the sort of key items that came out, both through our quantitative work, sort of mapping, but also for our qualitative work, speaking to disability rights advocates about the kinds of things that impinge on people's ability to walk freely in these kind of busy parts of inner London. In terms of good practice, I think we're really, really keen to see a sort of pan-London sort of organisation, rationalisation of what's going on with dockless e-bikes. And we know there is actually some support for that, some sympathy for that from the providers, which is really, really positive. I think that's shifted in the last year or so, because of recognition that while it's wonderful having so many people using line bikes, I thought the strikes the other day it was really quite heartwarming, actually seeing the number of people cycling to work on these things, but are becoming a problem on streets. And one of the challenges is that it's, we've all heard about the Hammersmith and Fulham, I think it was Chelsea distinction, where you could ride one up to the line and then you had to get off and go to another, so you had pile-ups either side. So a bit of modernisation of the regulation on there in order to sort of rationalise the streets. Also, one of our recommendations was something that London-wide, in terms of engagement with our business improvement districts and working with councils around waste management. So one of the big sort of problems that we identified was commercial waste. Again, this is all kind of fairly straightforward-ish partnership working to agree on what the problem is and agreeing who's responsible and then being able to remove it. But we've not seen a huge amount of progress on these issues that we're aware of, and naturally there may be stuff in the works that we're not aware of since the report was published in 2023.
Thank you. And I don't want to take up people's supplementary questions that are coming in, but when you say London-wide, would that require a change in legislation? Because we know that most of the roads actually belong to London boroughs.
Yes, it would, and there is obviously an opportunity both with the upcoming devolution legislation, but also with a potential review of the GLA Act in a couple of years' time. This is a very timely moment to be thinking about the kind of London-wide legislative apparatus.
Thank you. Does anybody? Yes, Tom Noble.
Yes, so sort of out of that, we did sort of some quite detailed dives into two of those issues, working with the Central Districts Alliance, who are one of the big business improvement districts. So those were into phone boxes and the issues around commercial waste. So we wrote two reports, one called Box Blight. So in terms of progress on that, removing the phone boxes, that is a big problem. It's very challenging for authorities to get them removed. Probably the best example is in Camden. They've done a lot of good work on really using the powers that they have to get them removed and sort of pushing back on the phone companies. This does take a lot of resource, and I think that's where the issue lies, is that, frankly, the amount of officer time taken is far too much per phone box, and there are still a huge number of phone boxes in central London. So I think the GLA can support local authorities. There is guidance out there now. We have a template for how they can do that. We've summarised all that in reports and done a handy flowchart. So I think things like that, the GLA could help promote and maybe provide funding if possible, or resource if possible, to help authorities tackle these. The other issue is commercial waste. Again, this is an issue that affects everyone, and it does require probably some changes in legislation, ultimately, changes to the whole system. But there are things that councils can do now, that they do have powers, various things around something called Section 47 notices, which require businesses to present their waste in a certain way. So there is work being done there, and some authorities do quite well on that, others not so much. And I think London-wide, you already have a lot of good work from Re-London, the waste board. They've done some really interesting stuff, not only on commercial waste, but on what we call Flash, which is flats above shops. So that intermingles with the sort of bags on the street from commercial waste and adds to the problem. And they've done some really good work on Upper Street, and there are some good case studies that you can look at and I think promote.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yes, Tom.
I would urge that we take a nuanced approach to the idea of clutter, because clutter implies that whatever it is has little use and is obstructing walking and wheeling, which much of the time is the case. But First, there are large parts of London where the pavement is wide enough to accommodate quite a lot. All of the walking and wheeling that needs to take place and the various other things that we want to happen on the pavement. So A signs are bad in some places and not a problem in others. So I think that is one aspect. And this, a desire on my part to avoid a word clutter, which I think is intrinsically pejorative when it's not all bad. And some people benefit from the advertising information which is presented on A boards. An awful lot of people are benefiting from the e-cycles which are plentifully available. I work in Marylebone, on the Marylebone Road. The footway is extremely wide. Sorry, I say footway because I'm afraid I've kind of learned that word. I'm sure I should say pavement. The pavement is wide enough to accommodate an air quality monitoring station the size of a greenhouse and still allow for people to move beside it. So, yeah, just a need to bear in mind that not all places are similarly in need.
So context matters, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I think Tom makes a really good point there, is that clutter to some people is really useful for others. You know, some people might consider streeteries or tables and chairs at the front of businesses as clutter, whereas actually, you know, many people working in the built environment would see that as placemaking and encouraging people to, you know, support local economy. So, you know, it's really understanding what that clutter means to different people and their different uses and how different users from different backgrounds actually utilise that space. And I think that's a really important part around the consistency. I think what everyone's talking about, what can TfL or the GLA do to help support that? I think it's the original question is, are they doing enough in that space? I think more guidance and a bit more leadership around that would be useful to set precedents across both inner and outer London, because there's such disparities between the boroughs where it falls on the roads that are operated and owned by them. That I think that's where the lack of consistency, you can see it sometimes. Tom mentioned works in Marylebone around Westminster, and you step over the boundary line into Camden and it's a different approach. So it is very much isolated in different boroughs about how they tend to use different things, and they're all going to have different demands on the space as well. So I think that noted, and there's also perspective from as a designer and someone that works on these types of schemes, more guidance around actually what good looks like in terms of street design for walkability. We have London Cycling Design Standards, which are fantastic, but probably need updating. There's no such similar for walking. There's the streetscape guidance, which is great because that's all about material palettes and everything else, but actually a pure, this is what a good walking environment looks like and this is what London should have, I think is something that might need to be investigated, because that might actually give people a bit more of a, we're all talking about best practice and good examples. It'd be good if everyone knew that and had that readily available.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the points that you just made there, Rob and Tom. So, Tom Noble, in your written submission to the committee, you talked about a number of inconsistencies, which obviously Rob's just talked about. What's causing those inconsistencies, and is that actually a bad thing?
So inconsistencies between areas or boroughs?
Yeah, in terms of in the report you talk about across London, obviously inconsistencies in terms of how how decluttering schemes are put into practice.
I think it really depends on resource. Probably is a simple answer, and perhaps some political will. And we have boroughs like RBKC who are very good at tackling what we call street scars. So that is where utility companies fail to reinstate pavements. It's not directly street clutter, but I think it could be categorised similarly, as it does lead to degradation of the public realm, and also it's prevents mobility if not done correctly. So frankly, they have far more resource and they've been very focused on that. I think their sort of highways revenue is quite higher than other boroughs, say in the outer boroughs. So it probably does come a lot of it does come down to, I think, just that resource issue of being able to spend the time tackling this stuff.
So a number of boroughs actually charge for businesses to be able to put A boards out, which obviously brings in revenue, which then can be put back into enforcement against worse clutter, which may have a more degrading effect in terms of both visuals and physical impact on the paving. Is that something that?
So in terms of A boards, I'd probably refer to Rob here.
I'll pass on to Rob
about that. But,
yeah, okay.
Which Rob? Yeah.
Unfortunately, not in-house expert on A boards, but not aware of any charging schemes. But I think I also wanted to come back to this point about nuance around clutter. I think that is really, really important. And our study was a audit of 3 locations in central London, very much focused on the business districts, and that so a more sophisticated approach to thinking about how London's various streets are used would require a broader analysis with the different parts of the city. But on the A board's question, yeah, I mean, particularly, I think your point, Rob, about the width of streets, particularly, I'm thinking some parts of outer London, quite a different approach required, and the same applies for micromobility and for dockless e-bikes. So I wanted to reinforce that point about nuance.
And in terms of micromobility, clearly a number of boroughs have already gone down that route. I think the point you made, Rob, Hounslow, alongside Ealing, of actually pushing bikes to be parked on the street instead of being left on the pavement, and certain providers enforce that, whereas other providers allow you to just leave your bike in the middle of the pavement without any consequence. So clearly an issue. Is there a particular focus from some of the studies that either yourself or Tom have done that suggests that there should be a sort of an easy win, quick win in terms of decluttering? You talked about half of the clutter at the moment being transient. So are there any sort of quick wins that we could seek to achieve?
I think so I'd say my expertise is probably a bit niche in the two issues around phone boxes and commercial waste. I think there are things in there that are relatively quick to do, and you could promote the use of those existing powers and accelerate the removal of those phone boxes. I see that as a good place to focus. They do take up a lot of space, and it's not just the physical obstruction, it's the sort of sense of degradation and blight and the other issues that they attract, particularly around antisocial behaviour. I think that will definitely have an impact on walkability, and likewise with commercial waste, again, is using those, promoting the use of the existing powers, seeing those schemes are out there already. The bids are doing good stuff with sort of consolidation schemes in terms of waste. Some of the sort of the big estates, like the Cadogan estate, have schemes as well. They're a bit easier for them to do so. But there are, I think, definitely some good precedents out there that could be rolled out more quickly.
And go for it, Tom.
Well, forgive me for being a little speculative, but I think the issue of where hire cycles are put remains live. And it seems to be the presumption of most users that the pavement is the place to leave them. Whilst we haven't resolved the legitimacy of making the carriageway the place to put an e-cycle, that would be my goal. And it's obviously the case that a lot of boroughs are pursuing the idea of bays quite actively. That has its pluses and minuses, but if we could simply move towards a presumption in favour of putting e-cycles on the carriageway, apart from in absolutely exceptional circumstances, that feels like a quick win. I know that there are concerns about whether a falling e-cycle damaging a car then becomes an insurance issue. I have heard this. So there are presumably regulatory details which academics such as me would probably not know about, but it seems to me an obvious starting point.
Wholeheartedly agree with that. Rob, again, Anderson, in terms of the report that you produced, you said that there are variances. Whilst there's been a number of successes, there's been variances between boroughs, and you talked, obviously, in your opening statement about a London-wide approach to this, but you also called for boroughs to have their own strategies in terms of how to deal with this. What are the pros and cons of that from your point of view?
And the pros and cons in terms of a London-wide approach was about, I think, setting often a coherent environment for some of these complex issues. I think the micromobility in dockless e-bikes one is an example, like, for example, a presumption in favour of, if there's going to be dockless e-bikes, they will be parked on the carriageway. Maybe some kind of rationale on a regional level or sub-regional level. For example, the needs of e-bike users are very different in the inner boroughs than they are in the outer. A sort of parking bay will work, say, quite well in Hackney, but if you want such a thing to function well, say in Bexley or Bromley, where you really might diminish the number of trips people will be able to do if they can't park on residential streets, and they can't leave them in kind of suitable places. So some kind of bare minimum approach that sets a kind of coherent framework seems like an appropriate thing for the London-wide. And then for boroughs, a lot of this is about mapping and also about sort of engaging with the kind of wider local planning environment. Those are the powers that the boroughs have. So I think we need to do a little bit more thinking about the interaction between borough-level approaches and GLA-wide, but I do think there is a real opportunity for a London-wide approach to kind of rationalising some of these, particularly for something that's emerging as quickly as the dockless e-bikes. I think this does feel like a sort of classic issue of technology and consumer behaviour outstripping our ability to regulate proportionally and sensibly. Overall, again, I think we want to stress, of a very good thing. which is we really like seeing lots more people cycling and using active transport. We want to make sure that it's enabling it to be a seamless experience that trades off effectively and well between the other uses of the highway and uses of the footway.
And I think that's a classic example where good providers, in terms of some of the e-bike providers, along with good, boroughs introducing regulations, can show what can be achieved in that sort of area. And then the challenge, obviously, is where you have that inconsistency, is where can we do that on a London-wide level, having a minimum standard. I don't know if, Rob, you wanted to add anything else on this point?
No, I think what everyone said is spot on, and I think that's the guidance they need. It's using the people like Ealing, where they've been quite strong with the providers to say, no, this is what we want. We know the people at Ealing, we've spoken to them, and the process they went through. Brent and other boroughs are doing the same thing when they're having quite strong. It's quite a strong negotiation, but they've learned from that and that knowledge share. And I know the officers across those boroughs do talk to each other, and they're all learning from each other. But sometimes it needs a bit of top-down leadership to push out and support that. So, yeah, I just support what everyone else has said.
Thank you.
Thanks. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, and couldn't agree more with all the comments about keeping the dockless hire bikes on the road rather than on the pavement, because I think when they're on the pavement, it also suggests that people hiring them can start riding immediately on the pavement, and actually, if they're parked in the road, it encourages good behaviour of cycling them actually in the carriageway. So, bearing in mind what Tom C said about clutter being a pejorative word, I've got a further question about clutter or things that affect the walkability of streets. Just in terms of do we think that we need to have a different approach somewhere like central London, where there's lots of heavy sort of tourist traffic and also kind of business traffic of people using pavements, compared to places in outer London? Rob G, you said in your written evidence that street clutter especially affects walkability in those busy visitor and tourist heavy areas of central London. So if you'd like to start, do you think we need a different approach in the very centre compared to inner London and outer London?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think it's really interesting, is it? Because we do talk about central London, and it's so many different competing uses. You've got people going to work. You've got such a strong tourist flows around that central area, and we know that those streets aren't really designed for that. We've got a historic road network that was not aiming to accommodate all these people, and there's also a lot of demand for those uses. We've got to service businesses, we've got to do other things. So yes, there does need to be a different approach. A blanket approach to no street clutter might work for particular areas, but out in outer London that might not be feasible, and there might not be the funding available to do that, and anything it's quite difficult, and it's resource heavy, that we've just heard from the others as well. So I think actually it needs to be context specific, a bit like Tom said. Not all street clutter is bad. Some of it's really important. It's signage, it's directional, it's wayfinding. It enables people to navigate the street environment, which some people, mobility impaired people, might really rely on to actually move around. But equally, I'm sure we've all spent a bit of time in Soho and the rest of the areas. The road becomes the footway. It's such a dense environment now with people moving around that it's very frequently there's more people there than cars. Except when you took a cross-section of that road through those streets, there's more space given to vehicles than there are to people. And a lot of the work we've done work on Regent Street and other places, to understand the flows of people, and the number of people walking down Regent Street completely outstrips the demand for vehicles, yet it's not equal in terms of the provision. So central London, yes, and those busy areas really do need a really strong focus on improving pedestrian walkability and enabling more inclusive access for everyone, because the people that get pushed out when it's very busy are those people that are not as able to move as freely as others, that do have mobility impairments that might need additional space. So that's something that's probably underreported sometimes, is we talk about people moving through central London, and we think about people walking, but that could be people moving using aids, that could be people in wheelchairs wheeling, that could be doing other things. And sometimes they're not even invited into those areas because the perception of safety is so much that they don't want to spend time there. And that's a lot of the work we've done with groups in our walking and cycling work with Living Streets and others, is sort of come back and said that people feel there's a perception that they can't be in those spaces because it's so busy and they don't feel there's enough space for them to move. So yes, central London is a really specific example, and outer London boroughs are different, but yeah, we shouldn't, it's not a broad brush approach, it's very context specific.
Yeah. And obviously some of that clutter is useful things like benches for people to pause and rest if they need to as they're going along. Sorry, Tom.
Thank you. I'll have a minor rant whilst it occurs to me, and that is just to say that it's extraordinary how much of what we find on the pavement is there to serve the carriages, particularly signage and so forth. And that strikes me as something which does deserve at least a close look. More generally to your question, I think Rob G is absolutely right that there is this concentration of activity in the centre of London which does suggest special treatment. But of course there are many centres in outer London which perhaps have some of the same characteristics. I don't know Croydon especially well, but I can imagine that the people of Croydon would be saying, don't whatever you do, forget us. And I can think of Hampstead as being a place which is not strictly central London, but which is very lively. There's an awful lot of walking and wheeling going on. So we should certainly be thinking in the same terms about catering for it there. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps just to put down a marker, because I hope we will return to this, and it's a point which Rob has very eloquently raised, the allocation of highway between motorised and non-motorised modes is something that we should not forget. And it's a massive topic and not something which can be tackled in a year, but maybe that's where, if we want to see Swiss levels of walking in London, that's perhaps where we really need to go.
Yeah, and particularly when you've got things, I mean, I was walking here from Canning Town this morning, and there's a building site that has just taken over a huge chunk of pavement, leaving one section which was just 50 centimetres wide of pavement and just said carriageway closed, and another section where there was just over a metre between a bollard and the new building fence, and that kind of, there was so much space that they'd incorporated into the building site, and it just felt like it was a lazy decision of kind of, the pavement doesn't need that much space, and actually kind of having, sort of making sure that people think about that space for the people who are walking is, absolutely critical. I think I'll hand back to you, Chair, in the interest of keeping going. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be talking about street furniture, and I'm happy to take any of the panel's answers on this. So we've got two reports here. It's Walking for Everyone report, and they've recommended that there should be seating at intervals at no more than 50 metres. And Wheels for Wellbeing, they've given guidance that providing seating options in sunny spaces, natural shade and in constructed shelter optimises year-round use. So how do we make sure that street furniture is always a pleasant experience and make sure that they're designed in a way that's positive and not become obstacles or trip hazards? Who'd like to go first? Go. Yeah, should we go along the line? Yeah.
I'll hand over to esteemed colleagues. So Arup and Living Streets worked together on the Walking for Everyone, and I think the research that we did is a lot of work with focus groups and marginalised groups and people that often don't feel welcome, as I was sort of saying there. They don't feel welcome in certain environments because there isn't space for them to sit and rest. For many able-bodied people, walking through a space, they won't even recognise a bench because they're moving from one point to another. But other people, they have mobility needs that they want to make the same journey, but they will need to rest quite frequently. So hence why that came out in terms of a recommendation. But that needs to be balanced. There's always a balance, especially because we don't have infinite space on the street. So it needs to be balanced, to be designed in the right way. TfL's Healthy Streets framework is really good at balancing those things. It does allow you to set a framework that isn't just about street widths, it's about shade, it's about shelter, it's about making interesting places and designing benching and seating into trying to build it into the environment so it's not a barrier and it feels part of the place. And then there's lots of good examples of where that's been done really, really well. Like Aldgate, for example, where that's happened, there's some incredible amounts of seating that just feels natural and it feels part of the built environment. It doesn't feel like a barrier. And people use that space in different ways. So there's some really good examples of great public realm in London where that's been incorporated. And it isn't a barrier, but it also provides that service for others. So, but I'll hand over to other colleagues.
I'd echo everything that Rob G said. The Healthy Streets Toolkit, I did have a quick look just now, but I couldn't immediately see what frequency is recommended in there. I don't know whether it's as little as 50 metres, but if we could provide seating opportunities every 50 metres on London streets, wouldn't that be great? I see obstacles in terms of cost and practicality, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't aim for it. More generally, what is striking is the positioning of some street furniture. Do you really want to sit and admire a roundabout? On the whole, that's not what I go out for my morning walks in order to do. So, again, picking up something that Rob G said, I think involving the community in the design, more perhaps placement than the minutiae of whether it's green or grey, but where do we put it? Where is it going to be useful to the people who use these streets? Seems to me to be an obvious way of making sure that the facilities meet their purpose and are actually used. It's particularly disappointing in the case of the bench that faces onto the roundabout to think that money has been spent on it, and of course it's not used because it's so unappealing. Let's at least make sure that if we are going to invest in street furniture, which isn't cheap, that we put it in places where it's useful to people.
Probably not a huge amount to add on this one, because I do think this is fundamentally a question of design, and I would echo colleagues on that. And good human-centred design will create things that people use. And on the specific sort of 50 metres recommendation, I think broadly seems like there's strong evidence out there that supports that as an ambition. There's also a point about street width here, particularly for inclusive use, and again echoing the sort of quality of the TfL Healthy Streets framework. So we did some work earlier this year with Team London Bridge, the business improvement district for the London Bridge area, where we basically use the Healthy Streets framework as one of the many inputs into a broader healthy placemaking approach for the business improvement district. And they have really taken that sort of steer and set of guidance from TfL and run with it. And I would say some parts of London, there's still work to do, but that London Bridge area have some really good examples of kind of a multi-use, pleasant place to be for all kinds of users, and importantly, at all kinds of day. The only other point I'd make slightly about street furniture is about uses and sometimes this interacting negatively with regard to some of the decisions councils have to make around antisocial behaviour and uses at different times of day. And I'm not a fan of hostile street architecture. I think we should have a lot less of it and that we should have inclusive spaces. But just noting that that is often a consideration for boroughs and for local residents when it comes to street furniture.
Yeah, just to sort of echo all those points, really. Benches every 50 metres would be fantastic. I think it's very noticeable in a lot of our high streets how few spaces there are to sit and enjoy the space, and be very careful with where we put this stuff. I think there's a lot of good guidance out there now. TfL was quoted. We've done some work on this as well around where do you put benches where people will actually want to sit. You need to be protected. You need to feel safe. That means benches on the edges of spaces, not facing the roundabout, not with your back to the traffic, thinking about sort of, shade from trees, integrating these seating areas with, other street furniture as well, like planters, etc. A really good opportunity for that.
Thank you. And on Rob's point about boroughs coming back, I mean, it's a councillor's nightmare whenever we ask for a bench to be put in that we come back with it's going to cause antisocial behaviour, which is, doesn't make any sense to me anyway. One of the reports highlighted that from Wheels for Wellbeing, when they came back to us with some responses to our call for evidence, also highlighted something that I thought was quite interesting. It kind of brings in the need for co-production approaches, which it said in reports that there needs to be a shift away from just saying walking to walking and wheeling, because then it will just change the approach to planning ahead. And we've been doing a lot of work as the committee and talking about co-production. We passed a motion twice now for having a disability equality champion in the GLA, that there is this more co-production approach to planning ahead. Is that something that you think needs to start becoming more integral to planning in the GLA overall, and when we're thinking ahead in terms of disability and having somebody who's actually focused on that particular area, like a disability equality champion? I'd like to go to you, Rob, because I saw you kind of nodding a little bit there. What would be your, from your perspective?
Actually, I was thinking I'm not actually really expert on these questions of design and delivery, but as a principal, absolutely. And I think, again, I'm not a designer, but, good practice would be that you do very thorough engagement and very deep understanding of all the different users of spaces into your planning and design. But I think a lot of this does come back to resource, particularly for local authorities. And, if there is space within the GLA in the constrained environment that we are to be able to do that work well, and also support the capacity of boroughs to be able to do that work well, I think that would be a very good thing, but not my area of expertise.
I assisted the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking on a report earlier this year called Active Travel and Social Justice, and one of our recommendations was that all authorities developing active travel measures should be routinely involving a wide range of voices in a meaningful way. So definitely not the kind of window dressing which is sometimes seen, where you're free to consult or offer your views in a consultation, but where there is a concerted effort to bring a range of voices into the planning process from quite early on. And it seems that some authorities have really embraced that idea and do it as a matter of course, and others are considerably more reluctant. So anything which the GLA can do to assist that process by encouraging boroughs to deliver rather than simply offer lip service, I think would be highly desirable. Just one other thought when it occurs to me is that we talked a moment ago about the affordability of delivering the level of street furniture that you mentioned. And that perhaps does pose a question of Transport for London and its business case toolkit, as in, I suspect that the typical proposal to put lots of street furniture into a street space would probably not meet a value for money test in the business case toolkit, because it's very much based on classical microeconomics. So returning to the basis on which decisions are made by Transport for London is perhaps a relevant and meaningful thing to do here. Are there ways in which we can attribute the right kind of value to creating truly livable spaces? I think that that's something which could merit some further work.
Do you think we need to have a designated role like an equality champion, though, that can actually kind of focus the minds in terms of co-production, though, going forward?
I'm fairly agnostic about the mechanism, I think, provided the outcome is achieved. If a champion is the mechanism that works, then I'm all for it.
Assemblymember Garrett.
Just on the challenge of benches and wanting them relatively frequently so people who can't walk very far from one spot to the next can, have resting points. And the point that came up about the difficulty putting them in, which I've also encountered, where we're told that this will become immediately a magnet for antisocial behaviour. In one case, there already was a bench, but it was literally a plank on two posts. And I wanted to make it into an actual bench with a back, and pointed out that probably young people are more easily able to sit on a plank on two posts than an actual bench, and it was the older people in the area who would benefit from having a backrest. The challenge is always from either directly from the police or from perceptions of what the police would say in terms of, well, if you put that in, it will immediately become a magnet for antisocial behaviour, rather than, I don't know, a magnet for elderly people going for a stroll. In practice, what are some ways to overcome that? Because I've found, and I suspect others have found, that's a real practical problem to actually either reinstate benches where it's become damaged and unusable, or to actually put in a new bench where it would be a new facility. Any practical tips from the battle-hardened streets of London? Rob?
I think actually on that point about co-design, so if you're actually working with communities to understand where they would like the facilities, you're engaging with them early in the process to understand where they would like them, that starts to foster a sense of, buy-in and ownership from the community. And, we understand that antisocial, some places, I don't think we should strip out everything out of our streets in case there might be some antisocial behaviour. I'm, very much in the other thing of good design enables people to enjoy places, and the more activity in those places tends to drive antisocial behaviour away from that, because you've got people enjoying that space, then people aren't going to come in and have engage in antisocial behaviour when there's people using it already. So if you make a place, really create places and make it into placemaking, engage the community in the co-design of that, then people feel a sense of ownership. And just doing a bench in isolation might encourage that, but actually bringing in other things that people might want to take ownership of, community planters alongside it, where people of the community bring and upkeep that and bring planting into that area. Community gardens. There was a while ago, there was a really great example of I don't know if people have heard of it, the edible bus stop. It was in Lambeth or Lewisham, where.
Sorry, did you say edible bus stop?
Yes, I did. It is. You should look it up. It's fantastic. So it was basically a community garden around a bus stop. So there was actually undergoing a lot of antisocial behaviour. People would just hang around there, but actually make it into a community garden, encouraging vegetable growing around it as well, just totally transformed that place into a place where people wanted to spend time, and that antisocial behaviour didn't occur anymore because there was a sense of community ownership of that space, which are the streets for everyone. They're for all the people that live there. So actually, if you start opening up to those people and they feel comfortable in that space, then those are some of the more successful things. And that's what we try to bring in some of the design work that we do, is actually encouraging people to spend more time there. And that tends to decrease the amount of antisocial behaviour that happens in those places.
Okay. If I could challenge, I was just going to say, if I could challenge the notion from my own experience that if you go and speak to a lot of people in an area, a consensus will emerge about what they want, and everyone will be happy with the thing that you're proposing. In fact, what tends to happen is some people go, yeah, bench is a good idea, and other people go, oh no, don't want a bench, it'll suddenly attract all the wrong kind of people. And so merely just having a conversation merely brings out that conflict that already exists, doesn't necessarily resolve it. So I wonder whether there was any evidence that, what is the impact, what is the, the marginal increase in antisocial behaviour as a result of a bench, for example. I don't know whether any academics on our panel know of any data relating to that. Tom?
More research needed. Well, which is to say that I'm afraid I haven't an immediate answer. What I would say, though, is, as I mentioned with regard to clutter, perhaps we should be a little careful with terms such as antisocial behaviour. And I'm thinking back to being involved in the development of a home zone in Stamford Hill a long time ago. And we were sending out leaflets to local residents saying the idea is that people might wish to linger. And that appeared to excite a certain amount of resistance because lingering is inherently suspicious. And I think that that's really regrettable because there's an awful lot of being on the street which is highly positive for everybody. And I'm a parent of teenagers, and if they wish to be on the street with their friends, I don't imagine they're actually going to attack anyone, but I can conceive that people might see their presence as threatening. So I'm really keen for us to try to differentiate between what is truly antisocial and simply that which makes some people uneasy. And perhaps we can try to shift the general nature of our debate to be more accepting of and embracing of the presence of people on the street. Jane Jacobs wants us to be on the street looking after one another.
Rob?
Just to actually build on Dom's point, which I thoroughly agree with, which is about the qualities implications of access to quality public space, which is by and large they're used by young people, poorer people, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people with disabilities, because it tends to be, when we consider the distribution of access to quality green space and quality spaces in general, they tend to accrue in the city to people of greater means in various different people of greater advantages. So I think it's even more important then to have a sort of nuanced definition and understanding of when we're talking about people, say, not liking the idea of how a space might be used, how much is that associated with the kinds of people who will be using that space, and it's about contestation of the public realm, which is a healthy and normal and natural part of communities, which needs to be kind of addressed and fostered, and the trade-offs need to be surfaced. But those equalities considerations, I think, should be front of mind when entering into those conversations.
Okay. There's a lot of interesting thoughts. I'm not sure how much of it would be useful in having conversations with challenging residents who say, don't want a bench there because it will just attract the wrong kind of people. So perhaps more research is needed, but I think that's the practical challenge that I think all councillors would probably find themselves having run into. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything on that, Tom? Or?
Yeah, just, sort of echo most of those. it does drive a bit crazy when we talk about antisocial behaviour all the time and we end up throwing out sort of just normal social behaviour. It is problematic. I think in terms of how we engage, engaging more widely, getting more data points, in sort of the usual consultations, we tend to, the louder voices tend to win, and you do drown out the majority of people who I think would support places to sit, would support those nice places. So, ask people what sort of places would you like, show them images of, I think everyone would support like a nice square with seating. But if you ask people, do you want a bench for people to linger, as we said, then you might get a different reaction.
Good synonyms for lingering, more research required. Rob Goodall, if I could just finish with you. There was a question in Arup's written evidence of the committee. You talked about you called for, in fact, consistent provision of inclusive facilities on walking and wheeling routes. Just to pick up that point, that obviously there's a huge range of different kinds of places, different, inner versus outer, central, busy town centres and suburban streets. So how do you approach all of that range of different types of streets with this idea of consistency? What does that mean in practice?
What we meant by that is that there's again, it comes back to the point we were talking about around different boroughs having different approaches to different things. There's obviously in the eye of a designer, and there's a lot of scope there to do different things, but actually some of the things are some provision is better than others. Some might be adequate, some might be best practice. And I think actually there's no, and I sort of alluded to this earlier about a consistent design standard for walking in London. At the moment, there's lots of different evidence and lots of different best practice guidance around inclusive environments and how that works. There's no consistency in pan-London. So actually having, again, showing some leadership from TfL GLA on that around actually, what does good really look like and what do we want to aim for in terms of the design outcomes. Again, streetscape guidance is great, but trends and the way people are moving has changed since that was probably last published and updated. So actually keeping up with that and actually giving the right advice to people who are involved in street design to deliver some of that infrastructure to support inclusive environments, I think is really important. There are some good examples. There's an accessibility order that City of London have developed around their streetscapes, which they roll out on all of their projects, which is a really good way of doing it. But again, really great for City of London, where there's lots of people walking and trying to provide an inclusive environment, but might not be used in other areas. They might be using different tools, either TfL tools or Healthy Streets tools or their own in-house tools that have developed. And these are all different levels of what we might call good. So actually a consistency about understanding what is good and what do TfL and the GLA want to achieve for their streetscapes would be, I think, welcomed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on another equalities issue around the facilities and amenities on our streets. And this is the provision of public toilets. There's been a huge amount of advocacy by groups like Age UK London, charities representing disabled people, people representing people with Crohn's and colitis, prostate cancer, and unions representing delivery riders about the lack of access to public toilets. And so I'm just wondering if you are aware of any really good work including public toilets in street designs, and of any kind of relationship between that and the enabling of more people to make journeys by walking. I mean, we've heard from a lot of older people in particular the fact of feeling that they're on a loo leash and ending up more and more confined to home. And just so, yes, anything from anyone on public toilets as part of the provision of facilities to support walking and wheeling. Anyone want to go? Go on, Tom.
I'm afraid I haven't got what you want, but I was just going to refer back to an earlier comment about the business case mechanism in TfL, because that's exactly the kind of thing where I can readily predict that the cost of introducing a toilet and maintaining it would make it perform poorly in the general way in which cost-benefit analysis is conducted. So whilst I'm afraid I can't answer your question as to the benefits of introducing toilets, I can say with some confidence that without a significant change to the way in which we do business cases, it will continue to look like poor value for money.
I mean, TfL has accepted that the provision of public toilets is part of providing an accessible transport network. So that is in their sort of equalities statements now. So maybe that's something, it's early days. So, yeah, maybe that's something that will be more developed. Does anyone else have anything on? Now, this is very interesting. You see, people working in the walking area haven't started thinking about public toilets yet, Chair.
I was going to say, Caroline, we had a conversation about this earlier this year, and I think Centre for London, we think that basically there's a bit of an evidence gap. I think the AGK work is really, really good. It's good mapping, but I think something that's making more of the case, as in more of the kind of the policy case for investment, we think there's a gap there, and that's, I think, sort of speaking to Tom's point about kind of quantifying the why. And this is, forgive a personal reflection, I spent some time in China last summer, and one of the things I was most struck by was being able to go everywhere and be able to go to a very clean, very pleasant loo wherever I went, and then returning to London was a bit of a shock.
Yeah, yeah. Rob?
I was just checking that I was going to get this right, but I know I've been given a lot of airtime to City of London, but they do have a community toilet scheme, the City of London, where businesses are asked to open up their toilets for people to come in. But I think, again, it's not very well publicised or signposted.
It's also not very equitable.
Yeah.
If you're homeless or if you're on a very low income, you're not going to feel confident to walk into a city business and ask to use their toilet. So the community toilet scheme is like a sort of useful supplementary, but it is not a substitute for actual public toilets.
It's very interesting. So we've done some design work outside of London for quite significant public realm schemes, and it's quite interesting you've raised it, because on the list of requirements or the scope of what we've designed in, restrooms and toilets are never forming part of that scope. So I totally agree with you. It's a bit of a gap actually at the moment about how do we design that as a fundamental part of the schemes that we're working on in the streetscape.
Yeah. Yes.
As a supplementary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that the Healthy Streets Toolkit talks explicitly about toilets.
It doesn't explicitly talk about toilets, and it's definitely something that could be updated. It's an issue that has been coming more to the fore, and TfL has accepted it for the tube network and the overground system, and are currently trying to reduce the travel distance between stations to 20 minutes maximum to find a toilet. But that doesn't exist as a thing for pavements and streets.
Just briefly, I wish I did have an answer. It's definitely a problem. I'm not aware of any good examples where they've been delivered at the moment. And just as an anecdote, we do a lot of consultation around the country, especially in sort of town centres, etc. And it is something that crops up a lot in consultations. People raise it as an issue. So I really would like to see some sort of further work on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Good morning, panel. So it's really the issue of maintenance of public toilets. In principle, there's nothing wrong with providing public toilets, and I think Tom has sort of already addressed this issue. But based on my own experiences, I was a councillor in Newham for 20 years, and we had public toilets for going back about 15, 20 years. And we had to shut them down because they were abused, basically. From memory, we used to charge for people using the toilets, and even then, the toilets were abused. And especially now, with the current budgetary situation that local authorities face, I mean, who is going to pay to maintain these public toilets? Not local authorities. They've got far more pressing things on the diminishing budgets.
I shall say the obvious, which is that cash is very rare at the moment, and so this is not a promising environment to be talking about things which are genuinely not cheap to run. So I'm afraid I can't offer a great deal of solace, but I suppose it comes back to this issue of prioritisation. We do find substantial sums to invest in certain things in transport terms. Therefore, we could be asking ourselves whether we're making the best decisions.
Thank you for the question, Assembly Member. And I think that this is actually not specifically related to public toilets, but I do think with a lot of these questions around healthy streets, positive walking environments, we we've worked quite a lot with the business improvement districts over the last few years, and while no one would look at the business improvements, they can see them as an endless source of revenue, they do have a bit more cash than councils, and part of their reason for being is the quality of the public realm, largely to drive footfall to business as their core purpose. But many of them have evolved quite a long way beyond that in terms of placemakers. And I think those conversations about the financing of quality public spaces, I think maybe public toilets, I think might be on the more difficult end of the items that might be in that discussion, I think is an interesting one, because we have 70-odd business improvement districts in London now. They've been with us since the early 2000s, many of them very successful, done very, very good things. And I think it's an interest in the realm of this conversation to keep on popping into my mind about both what good looks like and who the partners can help, but also some of these questions around financing. I'm sure some of my friends in business improvement districts are not going to be pleased that I've said that, but I think it should be part of the conversation.
Leave it to the chair. Thank you.
Next question is also yours,
Assembly
members.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. So if streets in London are not wide enough to accommodate street furniture, what street design principles could be used to address this issue? And this question is to all of you. So maybe we'll start off with you, Rob.
Yeah, I'm sure the whole panel will be really interested in providing a response to this. And I think it picks up on Tom's point where he came in there. It's about prioritisation. It's about what do we want to achieve from our street network in areas where historically we might have encouraged movement by vehicles. We might want to start to think about how that space might be better used. You know, historically, and there's an entrenched feeling that we can't take away road space except where it's underutilised. Sometimes we need to be a bit braver in our ambition if we really do want to encourage some of our. I gave the example of Soho earlier, and I know there's lots of complex decision making around that, but that is an area that at certain peak times, all you need to do is go down to Soho around Christmas time, and the cars can't get through because there's a throng of people, and it's essentially pedestrianised itself. I know there's ongoing discussions around Oxford Street and other areas. It's around a prioritisation of what's most important. Obviously, we need to balance that with access for all. You know, public transport, buses are a really key part. Taxis, getting people to certain parts of the, you know, we don't want to close off complete areas where people can't get access. But in certain areas, there needs more of a balance, especially where there's a really high volume of people that are walking. And what also happens in those areas, and I've sort of alluded to that previously, is that's not even, you know, the maximum number of people that could be using that space. A lot of people are, you know, the perception of safety of actually being in that space at all, that they don't even factor into that conversation because they can't navigate the streets of Soho because it's too difficult. The footways are too narrow, so they completely avoid that place at all. So when we're actually thinking about street design and how do we want to imagine our streets to look? Do we want greenery on our streets? There's a lot of competition for that space, and sometimes a lot of the decisions around what that space is used for is, you know, it's rooted in we need to allow these two-way carriageways to happen so the vehicles can get in and out of the space, where actually in reality there could be a braver decision to say, well, this is a space for people and this is a whole space for people at this time. And there's a bit of a reticence across probably the transport planning industry really, whereby there's a fear of around innovation sometimes around how we utilise our streets. We did a research piece quite a while ago around flexible use of streets and actually having timed use of streets for different uses, which everyone got very excited about, but then realised it was too hard. So actually thinking about how we can do these and being a bit more innovative about how we utilise streets, especially in areas where they're really busy, I think is something that might start to answer some of your thoughts about your question. But I'm sure the panel have some good thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I would endorse everything that Rob G has said. There is this reluctance to give up carriageway, and that seems to be a learnt behaviour which comes from decades of transport planning. I was thinking, as I was looking at the streetscape guidance yesterday, that it's striking. It says, whilst the desired width of the pavement is 2 metres, the minimum of 1 metre can be tolerated for a length of up to 6. And if you think about that, a double buggy is probably not much less than 1 metre wide. A lot of mobility scooters are not much less than 1 metre wide. So traversing that kind of channel for 6 metres would be, I'd have thought, stressful at the best of times. If it's a busy location where lots of people want to come the other way, it's going to be downright unpleasant. So we have streetscape guidance which seems to legitimate creating an environment which is going to be at best stressful for quite a lot of users. Meanwhile, we would be much less likely to say, in these circumstances, we could narrow the carriageway and create a situation where vehicles have to take turns. That would seem heretical. And I think that's something which we can allow ourselves to question. Maybe we have to be a bit braver about creating situations where, admittedly, it will be inconvenient for drivers. We obviously can't do it on bus routes, but there are lots of places where it's not going to be the end of the world if drivers have to take turns in order to provide a decent width of pavement for everybody else.
Rob?
Thank you for the question. Again, to defer to colleagues more expert in kind of streets design, but I think general point of the 2-metre heuristic is sensible and appropriate, but this sort of ability to sort of wind down to 1 metre for quite extended periods, it accentuates issues around clutter. So if you've then got building works going on, if you've then got commercial waste, you really have a very impassable environment for people who are wheelchair users, pram users, are unsteady on their feet. For whatever reason, this is one of the things that came through very strongly in our research. And again, I think that's where it does link out to this question of how we use the carriageways generally. Car use in London, we have more cars than we did 20 years ago, and they are a lot bigger, which is why it's great that we have a lot more walking. We would generally receive wisdom would be that it's a much more sort of active travel city. But those questions about the role of the car in the city, I think, does need to come into these questions about what a good street looks like. And certainly interested in some of these questions about perceptions of safety as a result of some of the size of vehicles and the size of pavements. I, for one, particularly don't like being cramped onto tiny pavement when I've got very, very large vehicles passing very close to me, and I'm a relatively young, able-bodied person. Maintenance of streets, really, really important. Like I said, in my own street in Waltham Forest, lovely trees on it. However, trees grow, and what they do is they push up branches, and it makes it very difficult for my neighbour a couple of doors down to be able to move up in her wheelchair. And she has not had that picked up by Waltham Forest Council yet. And again, it's that maintenance of the space that we do have being very, very important. And it's where we get back to this question of local government funding. And so, so I think those are my key points. And I've got another line here about overall car use, but I do think that is a bit, particularly in outer London. I think we've made real progress in inner London towards a city that feels more sort of welcoming to the walker and the wheeler. But outer London, for very sensible reasons, many people still need to use their cars. And I think that is almost the next frontier when it comes to streets design.
Unsurprisingly, I definitely agree with all of that. I would say, it's very context dependent. The difference between a suburban street and a city street, 2 metres is really not that much, especially when you consider those busy areas with commercial activity. We talked about temporary and street clutter, and that 2 metre rule, might be able to narrow that down to get around a tree, but actually for a lot of the day there will be bin bags on the street, there'll be bikes, there'll be all sorts. So anywhere that's busier than your sort of average suburban street, I think does need to consider more than 2 metres. And I think it's not a binary as well. It's not just cars versus people. We can accommodate cars and people in the right way if we rebalance these things. It's not just about sort of banning one and the other. Treating cars as guests is, I think, important approach in a lot of places, maintaining that access as well. But just generally any even minor improvements, I've got a stat here, I think, so just simple improvements to walkability can increase footfall in commercial areas by 9%, which then translates into more visitors to shops and more economic activity as well. So I think the case is clear for even some relatively minor interventions to tackle the issue of narrow pavements and other constraints.
Just to say that if you've got examples of good practices elsewhere, either in this country or abroad, perhaps you could sort of write to us or let us know.
We can follow up with some.
Yeah, that goes to all of you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I'm just going to pause for a second and welcome Year 10 students from All Saints Catholic College in Kensington and Chelsea. That's you? Yeah, thanks. Welcome. We are talking to some experts on how we can make pavements nicer to walk around, so hopefully it's of interest to you. And I'll pass to Assemblyman McGarrett.
I was interested in what you said, Rob, just now about Soho effectively pedestrianising itself just through weight of numbers of people. And then we started talking about delineation of space. And I was recalling 2 European examples, so Tours in France and Florence in Italy, both very walkable cities. Having been to both is definitely true. And this is how I spend my time on holiday, I noticed that there were not prohibitions against cars on almost any of those streets. It was just weight of pedestrian numbers. And it made me wonder whether, are we too wedded to, strict delineation of space and legal prohibition, whereas, Florence and Tor, for example, both are extremely successful walkable cities, certainly the city centres, which is the bit I visited, without actually having prohibitions, just by, filling the streets with people and tables and all sorts of other things. Have we, are there examples of looking at case studies like that and applying those rather than getting into a battle over X number of millimetres of pavement space versus, I don't know whether anyone else has looked at, it feels like a thing that Create Streets might have looked at.
Yeah, so I suppose I sort of come back to what I said earlier about cars being guests, and there are ways of managing both. I think sort of avoiding through traffic and through routes is important in that, and just making it clear that cars are there to visit and access and not actually sort of dominate that space. So yeah, you're right. I think there are probably some good examples. I think definitely around the UK there are places at high streets where you do have that sort of car light approach, which can work quite well. People naturally sort of gravitate to walking in the carriageway, but cars will drive very, very slowly. But making it uncomfortable enough for cars to drive very cautiously, but not necessarily cut them off completely, I think is an approach that works in some places.
Okay. Nobody has any thoughts? It just struck me. Sorry, Tom. Yes.
There is clearly an important role of culture here, in that I imagine that the attitude of the car user in Florence might be different from the attitude of the car user in London, and that's obviously going to determine to a great extent what they do when they encounter other road users. I don't wish to boast about my holidays, but I was also in places where the walkability was most striking, and it really has had an impact on my thinking. But I hesitate to bring out the phrase shared space, which has become almost a dirty word. What we did learn through the experimentation on shared space is that some places work and others don't. So you do need to have the right conditions for the kind of circumstances that Rob G described to obtain. For example, Seven Dials in Covent Garden seems to me to be de facto shared space. Vehicles are allowed, people mill around, they do so with abandon because they feel that they can, and they're probably right. I mean, the geometry is so tight that you couldn't go much more than walking space in a vehicle anyway. Most of the other places, I suppose it's unfair to pick on Exhibition Road, but why not? Exhibition Road seems to be a shared space that isn't. And that's got a lot to do with the fact that it's a long, straight conduit. So people in vehicles will struggle to see why it's anything other than a street of all. They've seen so many others like them. So it's going to be, as we've said so many times already today, about context, I think.
Okay, other Rob.
Just very, I think it's a really interesting question, actually. And I think the only thing, and I can't speak, I've been to Florence, it is lovely, and it is, what strikes me is that we tried to build London around the motor car for most of the latter half of the 20th century, and now we're sort of trying to undo some of that work, whereas certainly my experience in Florence, I haven't looked at the history, is certainly the centre of Florence sounds like it's sort of never been adapted for the motor car. So we are having to undo some work that we have done to particularly the inner city to make it, to sort of give some of it back to other users of the road. And I think that sets up challenge, and also that creates culture, as it says, it creates expectation and norms, and we are very normed in London still to the car being the primary way of getting around. There's still, it is less than a generation ago that you would simply drive to your job in town, whereas now, post-congestion charge, post-ULEZ, that seems sort of unthinkable for many people, unless it's part of your job, but for a classic office worker it is. But that was less than a generation ago. So we're still quite early days of quite a change in how we've thought about the city and transport.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. Did Assemblymember McCartney have a follow-up?
No, I didn't.
Before? No, OK.
Sorry, I thought I saw a hand, and then when I looked again, the hand had gone. So,
yeah. I want to pick up on maintenance that has been briefly mentioned, but as a local councillor as well as a London Assembly member, I have a huge amount of councillor casework of people tripping and falling, and I've supported all sorts of residents through making a claim to our council because they've smashed their glasses, they've kind of, damaged their face. And these trips and falls are absolutely devastating for anyone who's older because, A, it wrecks their confidence for going out and about independently, and they have a recovery process. And for some people, they never get back to where they were before they tripped and fell. So, the impact of these trips and falls is really serious in terms of public health and people's mobility and ability to keep living their life independently. So, Rob G., in your written evidence, you stated that a shift towards proactive, preventative maintenance is needed. And I just wondered if you've got, because obviously we all know that local authority budgets are, increasingly tight. So do you have any thoughts about, how local authorities can make the maintenance of pavements a really efficient and sort of cost-effective, what other examples of the most cost-effective way of making sure that the pavements remain well-maintained and trip hazard-free?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I don't have a really good case study, but I think there are ways of allowing the public to report on maintenance issues, and I think there's a way to go around how accessible that is. A number of local authorities also have a sort of a fix my street type, web-based approach where people can go on and log where there's issues, and they can hopefully get, there's a bit more of a process there where people can understand where that's been highlighted, it's been addressed, and then they can move on and it's been fixed. But obviously that doesn't help people when it's already happened, and it's that. So, actually a proactive approach to maintenance would be desirable for everyone, but I think it picks up on everyone else. But the budgets really aren't there for people to go and go, we're going to go and repave this because there's an issue here. There's potentially a role of technology around how do we start to use technology a bit better? Is there machine learning around, going around and surveying footways and very much in the same way as people do with the carriageway? You could argue that in many places carriageways are often patched up pretty quickly when there's a pothole, but there's a broken paving slab that might be there a year later because it's not included in the same maintenance schedule as the carriageway would be. I think we need to be treating our footways, I keep saying footways, pavements and footways the same way as we do our carriageway. If there's a pothole and someone comes to you and said, you've wrecked my car, council, you owe me money, that gets patched up pretty quickly. I don't think that's the same for a lot of footways and pavements. So I think a standardised approach to replacing footways and pavements at the same time as when you're doing remedial work on a carriageway, I think would be a good first step. Whether there is something that technology can do around quickly and effectively surveying pavement quality to see if there are slip hazards. I know there's been a lot of work done on remote sensing around streets and understanding what the streets are like from aerial photography, but whether they can pick up the nuance of damaged footways probably remains to be seen. But I'm sure there's a sort of a solution out there that might be able to support some of that in the future.
Thank you. That's helpful. Rob. Tom.
Thank you. Rob G. got there with potholes before me, so I'm slightly jealous. Yeah, it comes back to something we've already talked about several times, which is about prioritisation. But I think there's another bit which is implicit in what Rob said about measurement. And what gets measured gets managed is the cliche. We do a better job of measuring the state of our carriageways than we do the state of our pavements. And I suspect that's something which, if we changed it, could lead to some progress. I have a particular hobby horse about wanting to come up with truly multimodal measures of level of service, because we know what we mean by level of service and we can measure it at a modal level, but we're not very good at making comparisons across modes. If we could, I suspect we might conclude that the conditions for walking and wheeling are objectively less good than for driving. And if that were the case, then we might realise that a call for a pothole to be repaired is not invalid, but is actually trumped by something more serious on the pavement. And if I'm right that a greater number of people walking and wheeling are injured through falls than through being struck by vehicles, then that probably tells us where we should be concentrating our efforts.
Sorry, do you know that, is that an if there's more people injured by falls, or do you know that there's more people injured by falls?
I was equivocating out of a fear of being wrong, but I think that's the case, and I will check.
Thank you. That would be really helpful if you could come back with that. Do either Rob A or Tom N have anything to
I'll
add?
keep it very brief because it's more about, I think this is a reflection of the dire state of our council's finances. With 500 million shortfall, council's now spending 5 million a day on temporary accommodation. It becomes exceptionally difficult to prioritise some of the core purposes of a local council, which is the public realm. And I do think in the comment, and I think Dr. Cohen's points about prioritisation are really important. We are in a space where councils are having to prioritise between, historic rates of homelessness. We have, 1 in 20 children in the capital living in temporary accommodation. It is hard to make the case to be doing that work to beautify our streets and make them desirable places. However, that is an integral part of what London is as a global city. We should be proud of our city and be able to make it live up to the thing we talk about all the time, best city on earth, global capital, everything like that. And I do think that this question about the quality of our pavements, potholes, everything, it is about priority, but it does fundamentally come down to the fiscal picture. And I think that some element of reintroducing that urgency to the public debate, which is that these things are a priority, they are fundamental to our experience of London, and that is one of the many reasons why we need to completely relook at how our councils, our finances, with the overall goal of thinking about what we want our city to look like.
Thank you. And Tom?
Just a couple of thoughts. Yeah, massive challenge, obviously, with local authority budgets. I'd say, that prioritisation is very, very important. We do have money for active travel schemes, and perhaps we don't focus on, actually, things like the basics, like getting, those footways level, clearing the gullies so you don't have massive puddles by crossings, all these little things that actually I think do have quite a big impact on the perception of the public realm and your ability to walk. We talked about street scars in one of our reports, which is where utility companies are digging up streets and not reinstating them properly. I think that is somewhere where councils could get a bit of help and better enforce the current rules, and because that does lead to issues with the footway, uneven pavements, poor quality pavement that just puts people off as well. And then just sort of caution note on the sort of proactive maintenance and things like trees. We saw Sheffield took a proactive approach to trying to manage the some issues with the pavement and results in cutting down a lot of trees. That is certainly backfired and is certainly not something you'd want to encourage. So I think balancing those competing uses of the public realm are important, and there are good design solutions out there and practical solutions you can use to try and mitigate against things like tree roots and other problems. And we don't want sort of greenery to be on the back foot to any of this either.
Mm-hmm. I mean, presumably when you say mitigating against tree roots, do you mean sort of building the pavement out into the carriageway so that it goes around the other side of a tree rather than on the inside?
Things like that, but also, surfacing, using flexible surfacing types, sort of rubber crumb type stuff that, allows those tree roots allows pavement to flex, allows the tree roots to breathe and results in a healthy tree, but also a level surface. I'm not fully expert on all those things, but there are definitely solutions out there, and they did end up deploying those in Sheffield to mitigate against those issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. And I think that's the end of our questions. We've run out of time, basically. I'm sure there are other things that you may have wanted to tell us. If there is anything, then please do feel free to send it in. If there was something, any burning issues that you really wanted to highlight, then please let us know. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge this morning. Thanks for all your contributions. We're now going to take a short break until 11:30 before we resume with our second panel. Welcome back to today's Transport Committee meeting, where we're discussing the walkability of London's pavements. Can I please welcome our second panel of guests? Dr Will Norman, Walking and Cycling Commissioner, Transport for London. Helen Kansick, Head of Healthy Streets Investment Planning, Transport for London. And Councillor Rosina Chowdhury, Vice Chair, Transport and Environment Committee, London Councils. Thank you very much for your time this morning. So I'm going to ask the first question and then we'll pass around to the Assembly members for further questions. And my first question is to all of you, but please do contribute as you see fit. So why has progress towards TfL's target of increasing walking trips by 1 million per day by 2024 from 6.4 million to 7.5 million, why has that stalled?
Can I kick off?
You can.
And before I directly answer your question, can I just say thank you to the Assembly for, one, doing this session and this investigation. Every journey in London starts with a walk or a wheel for people in a wheelchair. And therefore, it is absolutely vital to our entire transport system. But it's also vital for our health of our city. I was talking to the Chief Medical Officer a couple of weeks ago, and Chris Whitty was just saying how important how we get inactive people active in terms of the prevention agenda and ensuring that health system works. And that role of walking is vital. And clearly, safety and the accessibility of the the infrastructure is absolutely key. We had 4,500 people hurt in collisions last year while walking. 61 of those tragically died. Each and every one of them just brings so much misery to communities, to families, to friends. And that's why safety, I think for all of us, we can say safety of all road users and particularly the most vulnerable pedestrians is absolutely vital. And so that's why it's a priority for all of us. And that's why it's so important that we are discussing that today. But you're right, that the targets that were set in that walking plan were ambitious. What we have seen is that I think walking works for about 40% of London's all trips in London, and I think about half of the walking trips in London are based as part of longer public transport journeys. So that's sort of walking to the tube station or to bus stops and that side of things. So that's important context, and I'll say why that's important. So I think from 2017 to 18, we saw a consistent increase in the number of walking trips per person. I think that increased from about 0.63 trips per person on the day per average up to 0.81 trips per person per average in 2022-23. But you're right, the growth has stalled from when that target was set. Pedestrian activity in 2020 due to the pandemic fell by 70% in that period, which is understandable due to lockdowns. But if you start looking at the recovery, so 2021 saw that recovery, it was a slow recovery, and I think that went up to in 2022, it was about 25% lower. So from 70% drop to 25% drop by 2022. And then in 2023, we've still seen a growth in that space, but it's still 13% lower than where we were prior to the pandemic. And so we've got this growth, but we have not recovered from that drop. And for me, I think it's interesting looking at how other transport modes have also played into that same pattern. So if you look at ridership on the tube system or ridership on the buses as well, you've seen the same pattern. You've seen that drop pandemic, and then you've seen a recovery, but slower than all of us would have collectively desired. And for me, that indicates a number of things, one of which I think this is indicative of slightly broader societal trends. It's not just a modal piece is calling out walking per se. That stalling is a change in the way that sort of people move around the city. You can see hybrid working coming into play on that. You can see some of the economic challenges that people face, either in terms of fewer discretionary shops for visits for shopping, people feeling the squeeze. You know, cost of living might not be in the headlines every day, but it's certainly in people's wallets and the forefront of people's minds. Fewer discretionary visits for leisure and those sort of things. So I think the slowdown and the stall you indicate is indicative of a wider piece, but there are some glimmers of hope in there. So For example, we focus a lot on the walk to school, because I think there's something really important about having kids walking to school and setting those behaviours of what normal is at an early stage in life is vital for actually the healthy educational outcomes and that longer term piece. And we have seen the walk to school increase from, I think, about 53% of journeys to 57% of journeys, which bucks the national trend. And we actually exceeded the target that we set for that. So we've set a new target, and we're to, I think that's to 60% by 2026. So that's pushing the work to school, and I'm really pleased that we're making good progress on that too. This week we announced that over 1,000 of London schools just hit the gold star on our Travel for Life programme, and I know all sorts of members of this committee have played a role in encouraging schools in their constituencies in those areas to think about road safety, the environmental benefits, and walking, cycling, scooting, hopping, however you get to school in those sustainable ways. So I'd like to thank everybody for that. So the overall picture, I think, is in line with some of the trends that we're seeing across society. We are seeing growth, but it's slower than we want, and it took a significant step back on the pandemic.
Thanks. Just before I come to the rest of the panel, this morning, our guests, when we asked them about the reason for it, I think they would also, I think they agreed with some of your sort of analysis of why walking isn't going up as expected. But is it? But they said there needed to be further research. Basically, is that something that TfL might consider to get a real pin down what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think these trends are ongoing. So the fact that we know this data on the walking levels and the numbers is an indication of how seriously we take this, in the fact that we have got counts out. It has been historically very difficult to count walking numbers. So if you get out and about on the streets, if you want to count the number of vehicles or even the number of bikes, you can use those. Those pneumatic tubes you sometimes see across the roads for vehicle counts, and that's based on weight. But for pedestrians and people walking, it is very, very difficult. And it's historically, literally, we've had people out with these clickers on the street, which is ludicrously time-consuming and expensive and not particularly effective or efficient or accurate. And so with the new technologies coming in with artificial intelligence and some of the camera technologies, we can use that. But there are also other things that I think are really exciting in that space so that we can actually understand this better. We've been using some of the mobile phone data. So you can buy data as an aggregate of mobile phone providers to get a sense of busyness on streets. And that's not just useful on actually monitoring trends, but it also then helps us begin to focus on where interventions are needed. If things are really, really busy, and you don't get the individual numbers, you have no idea who's actually there, but you can, as part of the data arrangements that we have in London, you can then say, actually, well, that high street's really busy. We know they have narrow pavements. We know there are lots of traffic. Is that somewhere which we need to target an intervention, for example? And so it's interesting seeing that, I've said this before to this committee, you count what you care about, and counting pedestrians is hard, but it's great having the increased technology, so we can do that sort of analysis, and we will need to continue to do that to monitor the changes that are happening in London, because it's too important to everybody's lives and the economics and the economic situation in London not to know what's happening in that space.
Thanks very much. Helen Rosina, do you want to come in with your thoughts on where we are with numbers?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on this. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Will said about school children. And that brings me on to school streets. Again, another way of encouraging more walking and more active travel is to create the conditions for children to want to walk, wheel and scoot to school. And I'm speaking from a Lambeth perspective. By November, 90% of our primary schools are going to be covered by a school street. And in fact, earlier this year, Clean Cities, the organisation, they did a survey of school streets across parts of Western Europe. And actually in London, we beat Paris and Milan as the city with the most school streets. Mm-hmm. So again, that is something that we can be proud of, and encouraging, normalising the idea of children walking more. And that means creating the infrastructure and the environment for people to want to walk. So it's not just kids, but it's vulnerable adults as well, people who want to be able to walk, but sometimes the air isn't clean enough. So decarbonising and making sure where reducing the amount of emissions on our streets means that more people are likely to want to go out. And that's, again, talking about the pandemic, one of the, I suppose, the byproducts of the pandemic were because there were fewer cars on the road, people felt actually safer to walk about their neighbourhoods when they were able to go outside. So it's making it much more normal and much more attractive for people to want to do the right thing, because walking is cheap. It's cheaper than owning a car. And if people are able to do it, they'll want to do it.
Thanks. Helen, did you have anything you wanted to...
I was just going to come in on the delivery aspect of enhancing our streets for people walking. And I think, as we all know, the pandemic did...
I just want to say we might come on to this, because this was just an introductory question in terms of... I'm nervous we might...
hold back then.
Yeah, is that all right? We'll give you a chance to come in on that, but in terms of the specifics of making them, that is what we want to ask you about. Is that okay? I'm sorry,
yeah,
I don't want to cut
fine.
you off, but yeah, that's fine. This question was more about the reasons that we aren't seeing the further uptake, but we'll come to you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Will, an earlier panellist made a very good point around there's lots of noise around potholes, and in fact there's even government and TfL funding for potholes, but then made the statement that he qualified that it's possible that more people are injured through trips than being run over, although he wants to actually quantify that. Just to give you a quick example, a very close friend of mine, dropped his car off at the service station. I offered to give him a lift to the office, which is a 5-minute drive. He said, "Oh, no, I need to get my steps up, all good stuff," because he's recovering from cancer. 2 minutes later, phone call, tripped over, broke his hip, and now had a hip replacement. Has been out of business for 5 weeks. That is to do with the London Borough of Havering. I'm not blaming Sadiq for that exactly. But as I've said, we're getting government support for potholes. We're getting government support for, TfL support. But in amongst all the lip funding that you now give out again, has there been any consideration about the especially the paving slabs? They seem to be a real problem. Even if they're in good condition, they need to be maintained on a regular basis, and every council has cut back on that maintenance routine. Has there been any consideration given to that?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Well, firstly, sorry to hear about your friend. My friend and colleague, the Commissioner for Transport, Andy Lord, also had a trip and fall and was having some surgery.
He's all our friends.
Well, I'm sorry, all our friends. I don't want to speak for him, but Andy had the same thing, and I think what this emphasises is how serious this can be. I sometimes feel the word trip slightly underplays some of the impact that this can have on people's lives. Having a hip replacement, if that's what your friend has, is a very serious condition and has some serious emphasis on cost, not just to them as individuals and their impact on their ability to earn a living, etc., but also to the health system and to everybody else. So this is extremely serious. I'm not quite sure that the data stacks up that the trips overplayed the number of people hurt in the collisions, but I don't think this is a discussion between what's the worst way of getting hurt. Essentially, we want everybody to be safe and feeling to move around around their neighbourhoods. You're absolutely right that through the LIPS programme there is investment and there is money given to councils to do repairs and maintenance, not just for the highways, and there's additional money for the potholes. There is also money available for the pavements. We have over 30,000 kilometres of pavements in London. Yeah, keeping track of that, frankly, there are not enough resources to do that in a way that would be brilliant for absolutely everybody and make it work for everybody. This is extremely serious. There is money in there. We have a mechanism for TfL, which maybe Helen can talk a little bit about, on how you identify the challenges. There's a mechanism reporting the problems, because doing a survey of every street in London would be would absorb the entire maintenance budget anyway. So we do work, and we need to work very closely with the boroughs to get that information of where there need to be interventions, because local communities, local boroughs and people know the streets far better than me sitting either in this building or in TfL. And so we do have a reporting mechanism which people can do on an online platform, which is where there are problems, they can report them. And that's irrespective. Nobody, probably outside this room and various other rooms in this building, knows whose streets are whose. You know, this is a borough street, which borough am I in, who's the highway authority. But this reporting mechanism will identify who's responsible and who's the highway authority for that, and then ping a message to those highway authorities where there are problems. So I think, I can't remember off the top of my head how many thousands of responses come in from that, but I know that last year about 917 of those were related to pavements and were dealt with within a timely fashion to solve that. So there is a mechanism to report problems, and then collectively with the boroughs there is an ability to fix those. Is there enough money for that? No. No. Are there still problems on London streets? Sadly, yes. We have 30,000 kilometres of pavement. The Healthy Streets piece with the walking and the design guidance and everything else that we brought in came in 2017. We have an enormous mountain to climb to make sure that's the case. And obviously there's ongoing headwinds because pavements get damaged and problems happen all the time. So my message to everybody is where there are problems, please do report it. We have a mechanism to address that. There is budget. Is there sufficient budget? Probably not. Well, definitely not. But there is budget, and we will address the most serious problems as quickly as we can.
One last question. Have you done any research into the type of paving and the risk involved? So, in my own little mind, I think that the big old paving slabs are a liability nowadays because of the inability to maintain them on a regular basis. But have you done anything to look at what surfaces are used and made any recommendations as to what would be good to replace, etc., etc.?
I'm not certain of any research on the different types of paving. I know different types of paving are used in different places. So, for example, I think I touched on in the last session the role of tree roots, for example. And tree roots, we all want to see more trees on our streets. They're brilliant for providing shade, cover, drainage, etc. But you're right, with some of those paving stones, as the tree roots grow, they come up and they create things. So there are resin-based, it's a resin-based permeable gravel that has an awful lot more flex around those spaces. So as you see the tree planting happening, you can see the change in those surfaces. I don't know any exact research on that, but in terms of the practice and the way that our brilliant colleagues are all operating in that space, there are different solutions for different contexts.
But could I suggest that you maybe do some research?
Certainly.
Because, if we can find that a particular sort of surface is higher risks, then maybe we should try and phase that out.
Certainly, and I wouldn't want to start committing our research budgets in this meeting, but I think getting an understanding of what that understanding is and the guidance existing there, I can certainly do and write back to you. And then if there's the need for more research in that, certainly it can be added to the list of projects that we need to look at.
I'd like to just come in on that from a borough kind of perspective in delivery. So where we've have paving slabs, they're often considered to be more expensive to replace. So more and more, my officers, as a ward councillor, are going down the route of actually saying we need to put asphalt down because it's cheaper and it just gives a smooth surface and there's less kind of lower risk of trips and falls. But the downside of that, asphalt is dark. It doesn't reflect light, whereas paving slabs are lighter in colour, and there's a vogue aspect to it as well, especially a violence against women and girls aspect to it as well. If a street is dark, asphalt doesn't reflect light, whereas light paving stones do. So that's something that's something else to consider. But it's yes, but again, cost. There's a cost element to it as well. So this is something that I struggle with in balancing the cost and also balancing physical safety as well as thinking about what our streets look like at night.
Thanks. Yes, because what we're looking at is literally are our pavements pleasant and attractive and usable. So, you know, I think that cost aspect and being cheaper but being less pleasant is, yeah, very, very pertinent to what we're saying. Assemblymember Garrett, yeah.
Chair, do you mind?
Yeah.
I've forgotten the name of this, but I just do want to say it for the record so that people can report it. It's the TfL Street Care piece. So if you Google TfL Street Care,
yes,
that's where people can report the challenges. Yep, and that's where we are. And I think, according to my notes, and I obviously didn't count these, there were about 28,000 reports coming in last year, of which about 1,000 were around pavement pieces. And I think all of those, 750 of those, according to my notes that someone gave me, got fixed. So
you're saying 28,000 are reported, but only 1,000 of those are pavement?
Of the 28,000, 900 of those were pavement related.
Yes,
yep,
that's what I was
in terms of that. And then of those, 750, according to my notes, got fixed. Others were multiple reports of the same problem, or had been dealt with by a developer, or been dealt with by the time it got there. So yeah, so there is a mechanism. My point is, there's a mechanism in Google TfL Street Care, and people can report it.
Do you think that's reflective? Because we did have a discussion this morning about the relative priority given to issues on the carriageway versus the footway. Do you think actually that's reflective of how much problems we have on pavements versus the roads, or do you have any view on that?
I don't at all. I think the fact that I had to look up in my notes, that detail, and I'm the one actually responsible for this, means that I imagine that most people out there don't know that that tool exists. Yeah. So if we can all play a role in promoting that, hopefully we can get them fixed in a more timely way. So I do think there's underreporting of this without any doubt.
Thanks very much.
Could I come in? Sorry.
Yes,
just because there is a sort of secondary portal, probably not helpful, but the two talk to each other, called Fix My Street, which is what the boroughs use.
Right.
And so the numbers that we've reported there are on the TfL road network, which we know is only 5% of the overall road network. So they are low when we're talking about pavement defects, but it is sort of indicative of the importance that we put on high street maintenance, where TfL is the highway authority. So we do inspect high streets quarterly, as for all aspects of defects, not necessarily just pavements, street clutter, etc., which I'm sure we'll get onto, but where we do proactive surveys ourselves as well, we've identified something in the order of 4,000 items that need to be sorted out. Not all of them will be pavement defects, but so there's a proactive element, and then there's a reporting element for the public. And the Fix My Street portal doesn't require you to know who's responsible for that. Neither does Street Care. So they talk to each other and will feed information to the other highway authorities as appropriate.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Thanks very much. Assemblymember Garrett.
Oh, so TfL data on walking trips, we've got it all the way back to 2000, and that shows almost 2 decades of unbroken improvement up until 2018, when TfL launched its walking action plan, since when progress has completely stalled now for years. Was it a success, TfL's walking action plan?
Well, I think I addressed that in the previous question, that it was going up until the pandemic, and then in terms of the trips per person, and then it dropped off after the pandemic. And I'm pleased to see there is growth recovering, and you can see growth in certain areas. I touched on the schools, on the walk to school. You can also see in leisure walking increasing. So I think there's a 24% increase in the trips for going for a walk. But as I said, there's been a change in a wider societal piece, and I think that's reflected in every mode of transport. So in terms of the success of the TfL walking plan, there have been a huge number of successes in that, in terms of the outreach to community groups through our walking and cycling grants that have changed, by hitting our walk to school target early, through some of the inclusive design standards that have been involved in that. I won't list all the successes because it would probably take most of this committee hearing, but you're absolutely right that some of the numbers have gone down, as I addressed to Ellie earlier, and I think that is part of a wider challenge.
I think blaming it on the pandemic doesn't fit the pattern. So when the predecessor left office, Mayor Johnson, the data shows 6.6 million journeys per day, and the latest data looks like 6.7.
Which is an increase, isn't it?
But it had increased under Mayor Johnson by nearly a million. He inherited 5.7, 5.8 million. He increased it to 6.6 million without a TfL walking action plan. So nearly a million over his term. And since the whole of Sadiq's term, it's increased by 0.1 million. So that's 90% less than Johnson achieved. So I don't think you can blame nearly a decade on the pandemic, given that the stall started 4 or 5 years before the pandemic, and it's now 3, 4, 5 years since. So why was Mayor Johnson so much more successful than Mayor Khan at increasing walking?
The data does not reflect that. If you look at it, the data reflects... If you
I'm looking at it here.
I will happily sit down with you, Neil, and talk through the transport in London data from 2024, which shows the patterns over many years per individual journey, per total numbers of journey. And in that, you can see the 70% drop in walking in 2020. Yep. And you can see the increases since then. You can see that it hasn't returned to that level. Now, clearly, that's not all to do with the pandemic, as I said out before. But the fact that the same pattern is occurring in other modes of transport, as I indicated earlier, does imply that this is not just a walking issue that can sit at anyone's feet, as it were. It is an issue on societal change. And I'm really pleased that where we have had significant interventions, for example, on the school journeys, you can see the success of that. And that has been a targeted approach which has really led to huge benefits for those people walking to school. And I look forward to carrying on working with boroughs across the city to deliver that.
The data shows estimated daily walking trips in London didn't really change 2017, 2018, 2019. You're not blaming that on the pandemic. It was years in the future.
I didn't blame that on the pandemic. What I said was in 2020, there was a 70% fall, which I am blaming on the pandemic. So if you look at the, which I think was fair enough.
I apologise. Yes. I don't want to chew the entire afternoon arguing about this. But
no, I'm very happy to schedule a second. We can talk about the data and the spreadsheets in more detail if that's what you want.
Well, what I want is you to explain why it is that Mayor Johnson increased over an 8-year term walking trips by nearly 1 million per day, and Mayor Khan, it's increased by 10% of that. And it can't all be the pandemic, because the stall starts in 2017, 2018, 2-3 years before the pandemic even emerges.
I've answered that, and I will come back. I'm very happy to talk you through the data on this. I don't agree with your hypothesis, and I do think that the change that's happened is a wider societal piece, and it's great that the number of journeys in London and walking journeys have increased and have continued to increase to that pandemic, and I'm really pleased that the number of journeys are continuing to increase past the pandemic of that massive drop. So, this is, all in all, good news for London.
So just to clarify, we're talking about the same numbers. The data I'm looking at here is estimated.
Garrett,
I think we might be getting into the wood.
I know you're not happy with the answer, but I think it's clear that is the answer you're going to get.
What I wanted to ask is, so the data I'm looking at here is estimated daily walking trips. What is the data you're quoting?
There are various data sets. So I've got data sets on all sorts of things, on the number of trips per individual, which is important because that reflects the per capita rate on London's growth and the size of the population. We can do it by types of journey. We can do it by undergrade. Happy to talk through the data in a separate session if that's what you'd like to do.
I think that may be what we have to do, because I feel like the chair is drawing a curtain over my time.
I am, because we're already running 15 minutes behind, so apologies. But we do need to move on. Okay. Assembly member, and just to say to Assembly members, we are now running behind, so we don't want to lose anything, because we've got a lot of subjects we got lots of good evidence for this morning, and we want to answer. We're here from our panel about this, so please try and be to the point. Assembly member Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. to the guests. I will just say I have to leave to get to a meeting in Bromley after this, so I just want to assure you that you haven't...
It's a long walk.
When I get up and leave after your questions, I'm just assuring you haven't massively offended me and that I'm storming out the meeting in protest. Razine, if I can come to you first, please. What are the main barriers local authorities face in reducing street clutter?
So there are lots of issues that are beyond local authority control. You may well be aware there's micromobility, where there is currently no legislation at the moment, so there are limits, and because of the fragmented nature of London, boroughs have their own ways of dealing with it, and micromobility companies have used that to their advantage in how they deal with the different boroughs and come to different solutions. So that's one challenge, trying to ensure that our streets are clutter-free and accessible for everyone. There's also things like EV charging as well. We're seeing more and more on-street sort of pavement gullies, or sort of cables, trailing cables, which are trip hazards. And I know there's the various companies want to provide gullies in the pavement, and different boroughs have different approaches and attitudes to that too. There's also we mentioned trees earlier. Trees are very important. We want to see more street trees because we need it for shade and shelter. But if you don't have wide enough pavements, then that makes it harder. And London, and I'm talking particularly about inner London, where the roads are much narrower and there's much more footfall and there's much more wear and tear on them. They do need a lot of attention very quickly. And in the last panel, the limited budgets were alluded to, and I'm just going to stress that it is about priorities, and sometimes it's about taking a data-led approach to where there's most damage and where we need to deliver the most attention. So EV charging, I've mentioned micromobility. Footway maintenance is a perennial problem, and that's quite high in my inbox as a ward councillor. There's always issues around that. And the other thing I'd say is that we mustn't forget the climate in all of this. London, we are massively at risk of flooding, of torrential rain, and we need to think about our drainage, and our public realm has to take account of that as well. And so we need to think innovatively and creatively about, when we're thinking about our footways, to make sure that we have sustainable urban drainage, whether that's rain gardens, whether that's SUDs, to ensure that footways are clear. But all of this is finance. There's political will to do this kind of work all across London, but it boils down to priorities. And as a previous panel mentioned, pressures on adult social care, pressures on children's services, on SEN transport, and on temporary accommodation. All of this, it makes it really difficult sometimes to fight the corner for public realm.
I'm going to get to finance, don't worry, I'll give you a chance to talk on finance. But before we get there, can I just ask from a council perspective of how effective is TfL's Healthy Streets approach and associated tools at helping local authorities to remove street clutter?
Well, we have a very good, I'm speaking from a Lambeth perspective, a very good relationship with TfL. And we benefit hugely from a LIP. We tend to have lots of shovel-ready schemes to go. We use that for our healthy routes, healthy streets, and making sure that we have training for cycle training as well. So we use that money to make sure that we enable more of our residents to travel sustainably. But yes, so to answer your question very succinctly, yes, it's been working well for us in Lambeth.
Well, I promised you a finance question. So we know the State of London financing. We know that a lot of London councils are basically due to go bankrupt over the next 5 years. So when it comes to dealing with street clutter, do you think there's almost a conflict of interest with some of this street clutter, such as through licensing? Councils can make money from licensing part of the pavement out to businesses, advertisement boards that obviously become, again, that's income generation to councils. As councils get closer and closer to the financial edge, do you think we're going to see street clutter actually get worse, not better?
So, again, from a Lambeth perspective, we try to keep our footways clear. We've published our curbside strategy, the first of its kind, back in January 2023, which is about rebalancing that public realm, rebalancing it to the advantage of pedestrians and cyclists. So we don't want to see our footways cluttered. We want to make sure that we have at least 2 metre space to ensure people with mobility aids, wheelchairs can get by, parents with double buggies can get by. So the issue of A-boards, I'm going to leave, because if we have wide pavements, then I don't see an issue with that. Tables and chairs on streets, again, if they're wide enough, then that's fine. The other thing I'd say is that we want to use more of our curbside. So in London, Lambeth's curbside strategy, we have the target of making sure that 25% of the curbside is used for sustainable uses, and that means things like parklets, tables and chairs for restaurants. If you go down to Waterloo, if you go down to the Cut, Lower Marsh, you'll see tables and chairs, but they're all in the carriageway, not in the footway. So that's our priority, making sure our footways are clear, but we use the carriageway for sustainable uses for suds and tables and chairs. And again, there's income to be generated from that too.
Thank you. And the final thing on this, before I move on to my questions to Willing Helen, is around fly tipping. I think that's something we've not heard a lot about today when talking about things that block the footways. I think particularly when going to Westminster, you can find piles of bin bags stacked up, blocking the way. I know, again, smaller shopping parades, that's something. Do you think basically we need to do more about that, and that councils need more support in clearing up fly tipping from that block footways?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's, again, I talked about footway maintenance as being quite high up on our inbox. Fly tipping, missed bin collections, all of those things are very important, because that's what people perceive as what they get from their council tax. That's what the vast majority of our residents understand to be a council service. And if rubbish isn't removed, if there are fridge freezers and mattresses, on footways, people see that and they want it removed. Some councils are very good and they'll do proactive removal. But as finances get tighter and tighter, I do worry about how frequently that can be done. So yes, councils will need support.
Thank you for those answers. So, Willing Helen, it's your turn now. So Action 6 of TfL's Walking Action Plan states that TfL will lobby national government to make it easier for TfL and the boroughs to manage and remove street clutter. How successful has this lobbying been? If we start with Will.
Can I kick off on that? I think this is something that we committed to when we published that plan, and what we saw across London in that time period was emergence of a new problem, and a really significant new problem. 2017 saw the arrival of dockless bikes in London. First of all, they were not electric, and I think we had thousands of them descend on our streets overnight. And this highlighted a real challenge in 2017 on the fact that you had a new technology and a new product that technology had moved on and the regulations had lagged behind. And the and that has since evolved into e-bikes, and you can see the lines. And these bikes can play a really important role in the transport system, and we're not here to talk about the benefits of e-bikes or not. But just in terms of one of the disadvantages is clearly that clutter. Yeah. And when we wrote the plan, we hadn't anticipated that huge new surge in. And the first thing we did was go to government and say, hang on, we don't have the powers in a city like London and every other city. So we worked with the Urban Transport Group, which brings together other cities together to say, look, these powers are needed. Unfortunately, we didn't get those powers. And so there's been a sort of series of codes of conduct and memorandums of understanding and things like that. But really, what is needed is is teeth and some regulation, and giving the cities the power to regulation. So I'm delighted that our lobbying efforts have now been successful. We now have written into the draft of the English Devolution Bill the powers that cities can regulate this new technology. And I'll tell you why it's so important. If you look at the e-scooters, which are regulated, brought in under the last government with the powers for cities to manage that contract, and looked at fleet sizes and parking, particularly on the parking aspect, you can see that there's a sort of 90% compliance to the parking of those sort of virtual bays. However, where you've got the bikes with none of those teeth, it is nowhere near that piece. So it demonstrates that this really quite significant problem is manageable. And can I just say, this is not just an inconvenience issue. This is partly a fundamental right for people to be able to move around safely. If you're visually impaired, if you've got mobility issues, if you've got a pushchair, if you're walking your dog, these are challenges. But it's also a safety issue. I have seen, and I'm sure all of us will have seen, people step off the pavement and walk into a busy road where there are obstacles in the street. And some of those moments, you sort of cringe. And I go back to the number of people who are seriously injured and indeed killed on the road. And so street clutter is not just an inconvenience, it is a safety issue. And I think where we have been very successful is actually addressing what has become an emerging major problem for London. And we are working with government and other cities as we speak to figure out exactly how we will regulate that in a way that actually deliver the benefits that e-bikes can offer without actually delivering these very considerable disadvantages for some people.
Yeah, so I wanted to cover the funding that the Mayor and TfL are giving to the boroughs through the LIP process to try and manage particularly the challenge of micromobility and dockless e-bikes. So last year, 24-25, we made a budget available of £985,000 to the boroughs. 962,000 of that was claimed, and that delivered 700 bays on Borough Road. So that was spaces for 6,500 vehicles, which is great. That budget this year, in the year that we're in, has gone up to 1.4 million for the boroughs. We're hoping they will deliver us 1,000 bays across London, which will be about 8,800 spaces. Again, really ambitious plans on the boroughs to tackle that. For TfL, our plan is to deliver about 300 bays by December 2026 on the TLRN. I will say that the traffic order process to achieve this is somewhat bureaucratic and onerous, and that's a challenge for both us and the boroughs. But there's real ambition here. The other thing that we've done is to integrate onto the Street Care and Fix My Street platforms direct reporting of e-bike and e-scooter abandonment, I guess, directly to those providers. So if a member of the public does report a problem, that will go directly to the providers in order for them to resolve it. We also have implemented fixed penalty notices for providers that don't, in a timely fashion, respond to those reports. So that's brand new for this year. So there's quite a lot of work to tackle this because we recognise it is a problem. We want micromobility on our streets because it does feed into the agenda of sustainable travel, but we need it to be managed properly.
Excellent. Thank you for those. So my final questioning is just coming to you, Willing, talking more about walking. Generally, in this sense, is I'm someone that tries to walk where I can. I did do the I did do the London Fact thing. Thank you for remembering. I don't get enough praise from my colleagues for doing it, but on my mission to return from being a man with two chings to being a man with one ching, I try to use walking as a nice.
I think you've succeeded. I think that's the case.
You're after something, aren't you? So exactly, yeah.
Romance somewhere else.
Exactly, yeah. So we won't disappear behind the barrier. Anyway, joking and compliments aside, as much as I'm loving them, one thing I do find when out and when I'm trying to make an assessment of whether or not I can actually walk to somewhere, whether there's time between meetings or whatnot to walk instead of getting the bus, I jump on an app like Google Maps to have a look. And what I find increasingly is they don't pick up things like public footpaths through parks and things, so it just leads you basically a longer way round. And I think that's a deterrent to walking for some people when you're trying to make a judgment. So it's just a quick yes or no question. Can I leave that as an action with you to talk to these providers as the Walking Commissioner to try and make sure that they're picking up footpaths and whatnot in their directions?
I would love to give you a yes or no answer on this, but I'm not going to. I reckon this is not. A yes or no question is inadequate because this is a problem. Yep. And if you look at most of the ways that increasingly people are using the digital technologies to get around the city, whatever mode. Yep. And so therefore having your phone being able to show that is a real problem, is really important to people. And a lot of the apps have historically used traffic algorithms, to show to move on to both cycling and walking, as that's the default. We on the cycling piece recognise this very early, and particularly how these apps push people into dangerous spaces. And we've built a very effective partnership with both Google, working with Apple. They came over from the west coast of the US, and we had a digital innovation summit on that in cycling, and we've seen those changes, and London has led the way and changed some of those global algorithms in that space. We've also, learning off that success, we did exactly the same for walking, in terms of how do we get some of those big providers to change their routes so that those footpaths, where safety comes in, can you layer on collisions? So that might isn't necessarily the most working piece. So those big providers like Apple and Google are receptive to this and can see the benefits of it for their own people.
Just for the benefit of the committee's time, could I just ask you write to me with
pleasure. Yes, very much.
I think I'll fall out with the chair.
It's all right. I'm actually really interested in this, but I'd love to hear more, but we're running out of time. But yeah, if you could write to us on that, it's positive to hear that there is dialogue on this, so we'd really like to understand the detail a bit more. But thank you for raising, Assemblymember Tyrrell. Assemblymember Russell.
Just very briefly, we heard in the first session that the use of the term street clutter is actually very nuanced, and it can sound very pejorative, and actually there is some stuff that might be street clutter, like benches, trees for shade, that are actually really helpful in terms of making the experience of walking more convenient, more comfortable, particularly for older or disabled people who may need to rest intermittently while they're making a journey on foot. And so just going back to the point about the Healthy Streets approach and the tools that local authorities have in relation to street clutter, I just wondered, Helen, if you had anything you wanted to add from the perspective of your role as Head of Healthy Streets.
Thank you. So the Healthy Streets Toolkit, I think, has been really powerful in changing the way that designers look at our streets and thinking especially about the things that you've mentioned, places to stop and rest, shade, to make our streets lovely places to be, not just places to get from A to B, because we know that particularly if you're not, like me, racing around, on a mission to get from A to B, these are high streets and places where people actually want to enjoy the space. So the Healthy Streets Toolkit, which has been around for quite a long time, is, we know, still very well used. What we're trying to do now that we have some surety in our funding is, through both the work that the boroughs do for us and ourselves, is to look much wider at maximising the benefit of investment So, for example, we have a scheme on St Heliers Avenue, which is ostensibly to improve bus performance and put bus lanes in. But we've recognised that with a small bit of additional funding, we can put in a new crossing so that people can actually access the bus stops that we want them to use, and add some greening and pavement build-outs to give more space for the pavement and also visibility for pedestrians. So it started as a bus lane project, which is relatively simple, but we realised that we needed to look more holistically at that space. With a small amount of additional funding, because we're already there doing some design work, we can add in some of the added value elements of that. And we know that our boroughs are also doing that through programmes like the Livable Neighbourhoods, where they're looking at the whole space. So there's quite a lot of movement in that, and we're really encouraging boroughs and our own engineers to look at all aspects of what you can do when you are investing. And you'll see that some of our cycle schemes, where the primary aim is to provide safe cycling, they also incorporate sustainable urban drainage, biodiversity and greening, and new crossings and wider footways for pedestrians for the whole active travel experience, not just for cyclists.
Can I come in very quickly just on that? I think one of the hallmarks of success of this is that it's very easy to do this when you're controlling a funding stream that comes from TfL. I think one of the signs that of really significant success is how this is being embraced by other forms of funding. So, for example, developers coming in and doing stuff themselves using that same piece. So I don't want to encourage a field trip, but if anybody walks down to Pontoon Dock, the station just the other side of Royal Docks right here, you can see a scheme that has been funded through the developers that has actually transformed what was a horrendous, it was a horrible road, let's be honest, if anyone spent any time there previously. And you can see the increased space, you can see the planting, the better lighting, and we heard from some of the school kids from the Oasis Academy, which is just down the road, talking about the fact that they then felt comfortable walking there at night for the girls, and one of the boys was saying he has to walk his younger brother to school and is able to do that. Now that's not from TfL funding, that's coming through from the private sector development, but using the fact that those policies have been so successful to be embedded in their funding as well, I think is a real a demonstrator of how much that's improved.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. We do have a field trip. Unfortunately, that's not our field trip. But if you have it, genuinely, if you have any examples of things that we should see, please send them through, and we will encourage Assembly members to go out on their own field trip.
I'll provide you a small
point
tour.
Of pavements. But no, please do. I think it's really helpful. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you. And it's my route when I go for a run from here. So I think absolutely massive improvement in terms of that particular location. Just going back to that point about Google, I find it really interesting that as a driver, I get to have an option to say that I want to avoid difficult junctions. But actually, as a pedestrian or a cyclist, I don't get the choice of saying, do I want to go on a quieter road or pathway? And I think the point you made, Rosina, in terms of earlier, actually, VORG comes into this. So you might want to be walking through a park during the middle of the day, but actually in the evening, it's the last thing you want to be doing. And I think with AI and with the amount of data that companies like Google now have, I think they should be giving pedestrians and cyclists more options in terms of the routes that they have going forward. Moving to the question, so we've been doing a piece of work around the devolution bill. You've mentioned it a number of times. So my question really is, should TfL have more power to enforce adherence to the guidance that we've heard about relating to pavements and walking, such as the streetscape guidance and the healthy streets approach? I'll start with Will, and then maybe get the other side of the coin from a council's point of view with Rosina.
Yes, I think we should, and I'm really delighted that that's in the English devolution bill. I think that it is really important having those powers, particularly when new technology is creating new problems. But it isn't just about the powers, it's then how it's used, how it gets built in, and those, I think both colleagues have touched on the guidance, how boroughs deliver it, etc. So really pleased that those new powers are coming through and the government have listened to cities in this. And I think that is something that is a relatively easy fixes that those new powers will give us.
Seeing I have this audience and you've asked me about powers, So this may not be in the English devolution bill, but I can tell you what I would have liked to have seen. I didn't know that zebra crossings are wanted. We put a new one in by a local school recently because the kids wanted it. They'd been just in the ward next to me. They'd been campaigning for it for 2 years, and we got them a zebra crossing about 2 weeks ago. And they're absolutely delighted because it means they can get to the park really safely. So we'd like to put more zebra crossings in, but they can only be put in on side roads if you have those beacons. I don't know what the technical name for them is. Yes, the Belisha beacons. And so you can't put them in without them. And that makes it really expensive because you have to put those beacons in. So as councils, we'd love to put more zebras in, but that is something that prevents us from doing it because of the cost. Something else, again, we councils would love to have the powers to enforce 20 miles per hour. Which, again, we don't have the power to do, but it's something that residents keep writing to us about. It's again, that's something that improves the feeling of safety on roads as well, where we're talking about walking. People don't like walking when there are fast cars, and they don't feel safe crossing roads when there are fast cars. And councils don't have the ability to enforce 20 miles per hour. We can put cameras in, but we can't use them. So that's another issue that we'd like to see. Safer crossings was mentioned earlier, and we'd like, we want to have more of those. But again, that's you asked what councils like to see in terms of powers, and that's what I'd like to see. But I don't think that's part of the English devolution bill, is it? So.
No, not at the moment. But in terms of having some more of those powers at sort of TfL level, and obviously appreciate a lot of that is obviously done at a local borough level. One of the challenges I find at local borough level is that you might spend a lot of money, and we talked about the quality of the pavement earlier and what type of pavement goes in. So you might have spent quite a bit of money putting slabs in. Utility companies come along, and we know that patchwork quilt on the road, but when it comes to pavements, it's not only a patchwork quilt that looks absolutely horrendous, but actually makes the condition worse. And when they do lift up slabs, if they aren't put back properly, that's a huge burden on your shoulders in terms of having to enforce that. How could that be improved going forward? What additional powers could come in to try and ensure that utility companies are doing their job properly first time round, rather than having to be checked and enforced against?
I think, again, from a local authority point of view, just giving us more powers, more teeth to be able to enforce. At the moment, we're limited in how much time we can spend chasing utility companies to make roads good again. And it's horrendous sometimes. You walk down the road and you see all these kind of patchwork of asphalt and paving slabs, and with no thought given to what it will look like later. So we'd like to see local authorities given the powers to be able to enforce more, which is what we're lacking at the moment.
So I can't remember the act, but I think it's the Highways Act, where as highway authorities we do have powers, but that act has been around for quite a long time, and I don't think it's actually good enough. So I think all boroughs and TfL, definitely, I used to lead the team that did all of the highway inspections, streetworks management, but also all of the fixed penalty notices and charges that we would levy to utility companies who didn't reinstate the roads well enough. But that is a laborious process, and it does bring in a small amount of income, but in order that we can then reinvest and fix those problems. But that isn't ideal. So I do think strengthening the powers in the Act that I can't remember the name of, excuse me, would be really helpful, actually, and making sure that streets are returned to the condition that they were in before, or to good condition. If you're digging up the road, you might as well put it back well. First time would be really, really important for us, yes. But there is a protection that gets applied to if for example, we or the boroughs reinstate a highway, resurface or a footway that prevents a utility company going in and doing any proactive work. But if they have an emergency, they can dig it up the week after. And I think, and we have to recognise that they're also struggling with ageing assets. So, you know, it's not a perfect situation.
It'd be really interesting to see the stats in terms of how many times they use that wild card, that joker card, because it seems like they use it more times than not, quite frankly, in terms of their excuse to do the works. And obviously that work does often need to be done, but clearly with due care and attention. In terms of, would you see having an obligation on utility companies to have perhaps a London-wide system where they have to have a time-stamped image of how they've restored the condition of the paving to local authorities to be able to check more easily rather than having to physically send people out to do that?
I think there is a process that achieves that. Maybe it's not as sophisticated as you're suggesting there. So that is perhaps something that we could write to you in terms of what they have to do now, and then perhaps the Assembly could consider if there's any pressure to come to bear to improve that. That would be exceptionally helpful. Thank you.
Just sticking with London-wide enforcement on street clutter, has TfL considered creating a London-wide policy for reducing street clutter? We heard about that earlier in our earlier panel, which ensures consistency in approach across all boroughs.
Shall I come in on that just to begin with? So, obviously, the Highway Authority mechanism in London is notorious in terms of its ability to do pan-London pieces. And obviously, TfL has 5% of the roads. The 32 boroughs in the City of London have 95%. But I think having those full sort of pan-London sort of pieces is challenging, and where we work together really well, I think, is that guidance to reduce clutter. There's funding available through the LIT guidance. There's TfL certainly reduces in own streets. There is the Better Streets policy, which I think we put out in 2017, which is a sort of considered and staged approach to dealing with the differences. Having a sort of, you know, pan-London bans, I think, for the reasons that Rosina mentioned, streets are different. You know, some streets you really do want to have people sitting out and eating and feeling where there's the width. There are opportunities, both from a revenue perspective, but also street furniture, bike parking, places stop and rest, etc. It all depends on each of the streets. And so having that guidance, but that guidance I mentioned has sort of got different stages of how that builds up. The first one is looking at sort of basically tidying things up. Yep, so that's bits of broken street furniture, unnecessary road markings. There are things there that are problematic. I think the next one is the next stage is decluttering. And that's sort of a bit more of a strategic consideration of why that thing is there or not. Then there's maybe even the relocation or merging of different functions. So you could combine signage with lighting if that's something. And then finally, you could get to really quite radical things like rethinking the entire traffic management of a space if you wanted to do that. Obviously, with that sort of that pan-London guidance that we have, that it ratchets up cost and complexity as you go up through those levels. But that does exist, and I know boroughs do use that.
Can I come in? Just to say that on the TfL website is something called the Streets Toolkit, which includes all of the different design guidance that is out there to support anybody, including third-party developers who are designing street spaces. But within that is the pedestrian comfort guidance, and that does give very specific recommendations around where street furniture needs to be positioned when you're considering designing a space. That all manages where us and the boroughs and developers are going in and making proactive changes to the street. It doesn't cover the more operational aspects that you're talking around in terms of dumped rubbish, etc.
And so, final question from myself is whether you've considered a London-wide ban on business-related street clutter. Obviously, from a council's point of view, we talked about the commercial waste in our previous panel. Also, phone boxes came up quite regularly. So again, going back to utility companies, and it's a revenue-raising stream for them. So even if they get rid of a phone box, they seem to replace it with something, advertising, hoarding. And in terms of the Can't read my own handwriting now. But
I'm glad it's not just me.
I should become a doctor. Anything else that we could focus on in order to get some quick wins here?
Yeah. I'm reluctant to do bans for the reasons that there are opportunities in this space. If there is the space and it works, then I'm all for bringing some life and vibrancy to the streets. I think the issue is really where there isn't the space and where clutter creates challenges and problems for people. So I wouldn't want to ban, we want more people sitting outside and enjoying the streets, but that shouldn't be at the cost of people walking up and down those pavements. Yep, there are some challenges that sit way outside of certainly a transport piece, but those old phone boxes, I loathe them. You see these old phone boxes that haven't been used for eons, but not for phoning. Yeah, exactly. I won't share comment. I don't want to discuss what they might get used for. But those require planning permission and all sorts of things. And essentially turning them into public urinals on a Friday night is just they're wrong. But that requires planning. The phone companies have legacy rights to deliver that. So again, talking about powers that would be useful is actually being able to manage those sort of out of date. Is another example where technology has overtaken the legislation. Everyone's got a mobile phone in their pocket. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any phones or the ability to summon help or access things, but realistically, we don't need some of that, particularly when they're not looked after by the companies that actually own them, or they just get used as massive advertising boards in the middle of high streets that are out of place.
But sorry, just in terms of whether we'd be able to maybe get some representations from yourselves and London councils in terms of what powers could be part of the devolution bill or future in terms of helping us to reduce, remove some of that clutter that we know should be removed.
Yeah, if you have any more thoughts on that, please do.
Happy to, yeah.
That would be really fantastic. OK, supplementary for Assembly Member Prince. I'm hoping it's short.
Yeah, it's been covered, so roll on.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. Can I just do a shout out to my friend Babs, who looks after the local phone box and covers it in beautiful decorations every time there's a festival or a community event. She does great work. So
does she do knitting?
Sorry?
Does she do some of the knitting? I've seen people do knitting
there are
things
people who do
on
that.
things. They're amazing.
There are people who
I certainly don't want to. I don't want to knock that. I just my question.
Well, she's going to be thrilled that I mentioned her work.
Please don't make me be the fun police. We do not have time. Bless you, Babs, but we do not have time. Your drafted question.
My question. I'm going to be asking similar questions to the previous panel about making sure there's places to rest and shelter and seating. And really good to see that TfL got planning for walking toolkit, saying that there needs to be seating every 50 metres and a parklets. The streetscape guidance also says there needs to be space for wheelchairs and scooters, which is all great. But it also says in areas that there needs to be seating in areas of natural surveillance to minimise antisocial behaviour. And that was something that was actually raised by the previous panel as being a barrier. So, Rosina, are these barriers for local authorities to create places of rest and shelter? Is antisocial behaviour an issue that we are going to have to be concerned about?
Well, it's a concern that's raised. I don't know how much of it's realised. I think there's certainly a pattern where if there's a measure to be put in, if there's a demand by certain residents to put in a parklet, to put in a cycle hanger, put in tables and chairs, and they will lobby for it and campaign for it, there's going to be a group that oppose it. And sometimes, depending on who wins the WhatsApp and Nextdoor wars, that scheme might not happen. So that's a constant battle for us, because yes, in the previous panel, co-production was mentioned, and it is about listening to those voices, going out, engaging, finding out what people want, what their needs are, and trying to deliver for them. But at the same time, trying to understand what it is that people don't like about it and trying to understand what their concerns are. Sometimes those concerns are valid, but sometimes they are, I think they're anxieties because they think it will be used for antisocial behaviour. And so the best way to do these things, I think, is to trial them. And we always say, when we put things in, we'll say, look, this is just going to be for 6 months, 12 months. You can feed in. There's an online consultation, or you can feed in here. You can speak to your local councillors. You can feed back. And then we take a decision after that. But if you don't try something, you're never going to know whether it's going to work or not. And that's why we always say, when we put something in, it's not permanent. We're going to trial it. See how you get on. If it doesn't work, we'll take it out.
Is this an approach that all councils doing? Because I have experience where my council officers have said straight away they're not going to put a bench down because it's going to cause antisocial behaviour. So do you think there needs to be a bit more a standard approach when it comes to
that's my personal opinion?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes there's a presumption that if you put anything in, it's going to cause antisocial behaviour. And we always seem to go down to the lowest common denominator, that a bench is going to somehow attract antisocial behaviour. Now, for example, in my ward, which I happen to live in my ward, there was a derelict piece of land that was really unloved. And we worked with local residents and campaigners to turn it into a lovely pocket park. And it just has seating area, a tree, some fruit trees, a street library. And initially we were told, it's just going to be used by drug dealers and, people who are just up to no good. And that was, I think it just went in pre-pandemic, so February 2019, it went in. And it's been amazing because it's so well used. My dad, who's 87 years old, who used to go to the gym quite a bit, but post-pandemic he decided not to go to the gym anymore. But he goes for walks. And he loves that park because the road is quite a long one. And he's able to sit and just rest for a bit. Because we put in seating, he's able to do that. And I think that, for him, where he knows there's going to be seating is really crucial for him in making a decision about where he goes. And there are many other people like him who will be making those same choices and same decisions. And I think if we need to get people out, we need to give them the confidence that there will be somewhere to sit. And unfortunately, if we keep talking about, it's going to attract antisocial behaviour, we're just going to keep people locked up in their homes. Thank you. I think there needs to be some bravery in those decisions, I think.
I agree. Will and Helen, has TfL assessed how many facilities such as places to rest and shelter should be provided in London to encourage more walking and wheeling?
A short answer, no. If you think of 30-odd thousand kilometres of pavement, it's to sort of assess all of that and look at all the examples would use our entire resource budget, and it would be relevant for essentially 1 or 2 days because of the level of change that's happening in that space. So rather than using the limited resources we have got available to survey the entire London and do it that way, I think the sort of strategic approach that we have been using to work with the boroughs makes more sense. So that's looking at how do we supply data on safety. We've got data on walking potential. We've got strategic walking analysis, which shows the areas where there could be more walking if there were changes to happen. And also, I come back to the fact that much as I don't know every bit of London and every street, whereas actually the boroughs and the local communities do know that spaces, and they will identify where those interventions could yield the most benefits. And so I think that strategic approach of giving that of where to invest is really important, and I would focus on that. And then boroughs and residents knowing where to do it. So I was out in Islington earlier this week or last week. And that you could see how they had been making interventions to widen streets in certain places. They'd provided seating outside a school, or they had some of the modal filters that they'd put in off some of the main roads on a high street had suddenly provided seating. But that had been in conjunction with the community and the businesses. And
so your answer is no, but I think it's a good idea that we should do it, should have an assessment.
No, my answer is very much, I'm not sure that surveying every street in London is the best use of resources. I think that what we need is that strategic information on where you can make interventions happen, and then use the boroughs and that local knowledge who know these spaces to make those decisions.
I mean, there's an argument to say. I mean, we've been working with Inclusion London, as you know, in terms of this. There's going to be an event on Monday, the Disability Action Plan engagement. There's going to be a big celebration that we've pushed as the London Assembly. We had a unanimous motion to get this to happen, to make sure that there's more co-production. That's a way forward to make sure that, you know, that kind of decision-making and how we set up our areas are done in a way that it does make sure that we don't have any of these mistakes and that we don't have spaces that aren't going to be accessible, etc. And having a disability champion would be a great idea, wouldn't it?
I think everybody should be a disability champion because it affects so many different areas of everybody's aspect of life. I just think that, I come back to my original point, doing a survey of every street in London would be a waste of time because each of those streets will change before the survey is finished. And that's why that local information is so important. And that's why that partnership between the boroughs, between TfL, communities and businesses is actually how you can get that change with a strategic overview that is obviously as a
disability champion here in City Hall.
Pardon?
And a disability champion here in City Hall.
I think we have probably, hopefully, in this committee and across City Hall, we have many champions for disability because it has to happen in transport, housing, business, every aspect of our public life needs. Everybody should be that disability champion.
Can I come in just with a couple of things, perhaps to reassure the Assembly member? So when we issue the funding for boroughs under LIP, they come up with their plans based on a very detailed set of data, which includes propensity to walk and strategic walking analysis. So that really, we don't have much money. £156 million for the Healthy Streets budget this year is not enough to do everything that you're talking about, but actually targeting those where we think there'll be the highest propensity to get people to walk or to travel actively, then enables those boroughs to take the Healthy Streets guidance and look at all of aspects, and including places to sit and rest. And just another perspective on concerns around creating seating, which then generates antisocial behaviour. There have been a couple of examples I personally know. One associated with the Nine Elms corridor. We're doing a large piece of work there, but on some of the private developers, they have built in play on the way aspects. So there is seating, but there are also places for families to linger and play. Another great example where I live in Ilford is the High Street. They have put in play on the way, interactive things, so that where you've got seating, it's encouraging families as well as people who need to perhaps rest for disability reasons. So, and that helps to detract antisocial behaviour. So there are ways that we can sort of creatively look at these spaces. And now we've got more assurance on our funding. I think that will hopefully open up people's ability to, or the designers' ability to think more creatively about particularly those aspects of Healthy Streets.
That term you used, I can't remember, it's in our guidance, so I probably should know, but I think you mentioned, is it natural surveillance? Yeah. It all sounds very sinister. Yeah, but just to sort of, that is essentially having people hanging out. Yep, and it's Jane Jacobs, brilliant urban American, but it's basically, if you've got people hanging out in the street, whether they are living there, they are passing by, their businesses, streets, everything else, everybody feels safer if other people are around. Yep, and I think that's such a fundamental piece in how our streets operate, is that people use them, people are there, yeah? And so having shop fronts that are active, streets that are vibrant, that in its own right brings that sense of self-safety. So natural surveillance in itself sounds like something out of 1984. What it actually means is people hanging out, which I think is an inherently good thing and works for everybody.
Thanks very much. And just to say, we do have a few more questions drafted, but some of them are on quite chunky subjects. So we're going to, if okay, going to put them in writing to you. So apologies, we haven't quite covered everything we'd like to, but it's been a really good discussion. So the last question is Caroline, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll try and be very, very speedy. Transport for London's Equity in Motion has accepted that provision of public toilets is something that is a part of providing an accessible transport network, and the Mayor is investing very brilliantly in installing more public toilets and renovating toilets on the public transport network. Just wondering if you have thought about whether the Healthy Streets approach needs to have some kind of update to include toilets. I'm not going to suggest exactly how that might be, but there could be stuff to do with mapping. There could be, and it could be about bringing new toilets into being. I was very pleased to see on Sunday at Oxford Street that there was a changing places toilet, so anyone who needs a hoist was accounted for, and that there was a huge block of public toilets as well, and that had all gone in for that one-day event. So that it was really good to see that TfL had thought of that. So yeah, that's the question.
Thanks. Yeah, I like those as well. You're absolutely right. The public toilets they're a key piece of social infrastructure, aren't they? And particularly as our population, London's got an ageing population like the rest of the UK, and as I age, I need to maybe use the toilet a bit more too. But I'm really pleased that things like the London Plan includes that focus on new public toilet provision in large public areas of public realm. The monitoring data for that policy will be used to inform the next London Plan, which is being worked up at the moment. And the age-friendly action plan also commits to the provision of new public toilets. And as you said, TfL is investing, I think, 15 million at the moment on those new public toilets over on the transport network. And the transport network is part of the streets. And so those public toilets will be open to everybody. And I've seen some of the pictures of the new public toilets, and it's very exciting just seeing how, it makes a massive difference to people's lives. The Good Growth Fund as well is being used to help deliver some of those toilets. I think as of July, according to my notes anyway, as of July 2025, there have been over 300 individual sets of new toilets being provided across 53 different sites. We need to continue to deliver that. It isn't just a matter of the public sector providing that. It's also about the toilets that are available on the streets, making sure that business improvement districts and businesses are open there so that people can feel able to come in, and they don't necessarily need to buy a £5 cup of coffee if they're desperate to use the street. So I think there is a responsibility collectively for London. If we want our high streets to be busy from a business perspective and get that footfall and that retail, then how do those businesses make sure that people feel comfortable going in there and they don't need to buy a luxury latte or a drink or something else to feel that they need to pay the rent to use the toilets? So I think that is something that we all collectively need to do, because the public sector can't provide every toilet on every street. In regards to the Healthy Streets piece, we are very clear how toilets play a role in moving people around the city. What I wouldn't want to see is that introduced into the Healthy Streets guidance and the design standards, because they have to be for that to work. And I think part of the success that Helen's team and Rosina's team and all the boroughs across the capital have done has been used those Healthy Streets guidances for every street. Yep, and it needs to be there for every street and plays up. And not every street would be appropriate or possible to deliver the public toilets. It would be, it'd be unaffordable and impossible. However, how we work with the Healthy Streets guidance and all those other guidance to ensure that toilets are a part of the provision for wider London life, whether that's making the most of public buildings and public transport, private sector pieces, new public realms, etc. We have to future-proof our city, not just in terms of the climate mitigation and other things, but also for making sure that everybody has access to our streets and feels comfortable in those journeys. And I know how important toilets are in part of that, in those standards.
Thank you. Great note to end on. Chair, back to you.
Thanks very much. And that's the end of our questions, or we're running out of time,
and please,
basically.
if you've got more questions, do send them.
We will write to you with the questions we didn't manage to ask, but also if there is anything that you really wanted to tell us that you have not had time or we haven't asked the right questions, please do feel free to send that in to us. But thank you very much for your time this morning stroke afternoon. You're free to leave, although we'll only be a few more seconds before we're all done. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate to me as chair, in consultation with party group lead members, to agree any output arising from the meeting? Can I ask the committee to note its work programme and meeting dates? And delegate authority to me as chair, in consultation with party group lead members, to agree the extension of the appointment of 3 members of the London Travel Watch Board. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 23rd of October 2025 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. There is no urgent business. It's been a long morning. There's no urgent business. Thank you. This meeting is now closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall.